Hello and welcome to Ranger Screams. I hope you're doing well. Get comfortable, relax, and let these stories keep you company tonight. You're safe here. Before we begin, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. I always love reading your comments. If you enjoy tonight's stories, please leave a like and subscribe. Your support means everything. Now, let's begin. The faintest hint of dawn crept through the pines as I stepped onto the weathered porch of my cabin. Steam rose from my coffee mug, disappearing into the cool mountain air. Lake Nemeshin stretched before me, its surface perfectly still, mirroring the towering peaks that surrounded it like ancient guardians. This remote corner of the Cascade Wilderness had been my home for 3 seasons now, and I still hadn't grown tired of the view. My name is Qualetica Rivers. Kale to most people who struggle with the pronunciation. The name means guardian of the people in Hopi, a weighty inheritance from my grandfather who insisted I carry on the tradition even though our bloodline had been diluted through generations of marriage outside the tribe. Sometimes I wondered if that name had somehow guided me to this life, to this isolated ranger station 26 miles from the nearest town. I took a long sip of coffee, savoring the bitter warmth as I contemplated the day ahead. Spring melt-off had finally subsided, and the summer hiking season would soon bring scattered groups of tourists to test themselves against the wilderness. For now, though, the forest belonged to me, and the creatures that called it home. The radio crackled to life from inside the cabin. Nemeshin Station. This is dispatch. Come in. I sighed and walked back inside, setting my mug on the small table crowded with maps and logbooks. Nemeshin Station receiving. Go ahead, dispatch, I answered, pressing the transmit button. Morning, Kale. Just checking in. Any issues to report? All quiet here, dispatch. Trail assessment scheduled for today. Northwest Passage up to Mirror Lake. Copy that. We've got reports of some deadfall on that route after the storms last week. Might want to bring the chainsaw. Already loaded in the UTV. Anything else? Yeah, you've got visitors coming. 2 researchers from the university, scheduled to arrive tomorrow. They're doing some kind of habitat study. Official paperwork came through last night. I frowned. No one had mentioned visitors, especially this early in the season. Copy that. I'll prepare the guest cabin. Nemeshin out. I placed the radio back in its charger and returned to the porch, my peaceful morning routine disrupted. The guest cabin hadn't been used since last fall. It would need cleaning and fresh supplies. The sun had finally crested the eastern ridge, casting long shadows across the lake. In the new light, I noticed something unusual on the far shore, a dark shape moving along the tree line. I reached for my binoculars and focused on the area. Nothing. Whatever it was had disappeared into the dense forest, probably a moose or elk, coming down for a morning drink. Yet something about the movement had seemed different, more deliberate. I shook off the uneasiness. After years as a park ranger, I'd learned to trust my instincts, but I'd also learned that the forest plays tricks on the eyes, especially in the half-light of dawn. After finishing my coffee, I packed gear for the day's work. The Northwest Trail needed clearing before the seasonal influx of hikers. The Forest Service issued me standard equipment, handheld radio, first aid kit, maps, compass, multi-tool, but experience had taught me to add my own essentials: extra water, high-calorie snacks, emergency shelter, and a revolver. The gun was technically against regulations, but after an encounter with a rabid wolf 2 years ago, I never ventured into the backcountry without it. As I loaded the utility vehicle, my thoughts drifted to how I'd ended up here. Most of my academy classmates had chosen busier parks with more amenities and better pay. But something about Nemeshin had called to me when the position opened up. Maybe it was the challenge of complete self-reliance. Maybe it was the escape from a failed relationship and mounting debts. Or maybe it was something deeper, a connection to this land that I couldn't quite explain. My grandfather would have said the mountains had chosen me, not the other way around. He believed in such things. Spirits in the trees, voices in the wind, ancient beings watching from the shadows. As a child, I'd absorbed his stories like gospel. As an adult with a degree in forestry and wildlife management, I'd filed them away as cultural mythology. Beautiful, but not literal. Yet sometimes, alone in these woods, I caught myself listening for those voices. I drove the UTV along the shoreline trail, heading northwest toward the area where fallen trees had been reported. The morning warmed quickly as spring sunshine filtered through the canopy. Birds called overhead, and occasionally I spotted deer watching curiously from the undergrowth before bounding away. About 3 miles in, I encountered the first major obstacle, a massive old-growth pine that had toppled across the trail. The trunk was over 3 feet in diameter, far too large for my chainsaw to handle in one cut. I'd need to section it carefully. As I prepared the equipment, the forest around me fell suddenly, unnaturally silent. No birdsong, no rustling leaves, no chattering squirrels. Just complete stillness that prickled the hair on my neck. I switched off the chainsaw and listened. Nothing. Then, from somewhere up the slope to my right, came the distinct sound of breaking branches, heavy footsteps moving through the underbrush. "Hello," I called out. "This is Ranger Rivers. Identify yourself." No response. But the sounds continued, moving parallel to the trail. Whatever was up there was large and making no effort to conceal its presence. A bear, perhaps. But bears typically avoided humans once detected. I unholstered my revolver and held it at my side, more for reassurance than any immediate intent to use it. "Hello?" I tried again, louder this time. The movement stopped. I could feel eyes on me, watching, assessing. I scanned the dense forest but saw nothing unusual among the trees and shadows. Then came a smell. Musky, wild, unlike anything I'd encountered before. Not the familiar scent of bear or moose or any woodland creature I knew. This was different, primal. For several long minutes I stood motionless, weapon ready, senses straining. Gradually birds resumed their calls, tentatively at first, then with growing confidence. The presence, whatever it was, had moved on. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Logical explanations filled my mind. A moose or elk I hadn't properly identified. Perhaps even a woodland bison that had wandered from the reintroduction area 50 miles north. Yet none of these explanations felt right. With unsteady hands, I started the chainsaw again and turned my attention back to the fallen tree. But the sense of being watched never fully subsided. By late afternoon, I'd cleared 3 major blockages and numerous smaller branches from the trail. The work had been physically demanding but mentally soothing. The kind of tangible accomplishment that had drawn me to this job in the first place. As I headed back toward the station, dark clouds began gathering over the western peaks. A spring storm was rolling in, earlier than the weather report had predicted. I pushed the UTV a little faster, hoping to reach the cabin before the downpour. I was about a mile from the station when I spotted fresh tracks crossing the trail. Large, human-like footprints pressed deep into the soft earth. I stopped the vehicle and knelt to examine them more closely. The prints were unlike any human boot I'd ever seen. Elongated, nearly 18 inches in length, with 5 distinct toe impressions. Too large for a person, but too structured for a bear. I took photos with my phone and used my hand for scale. The stride length between prints was enormous, suggesting whatever made them stood well over 7 feet tall. A joke, perhaps. Some hiker with homemade Sasquatch feet playing games? But we'd had no reports of visitors in this area for weeks, and the tracks appeared fresh, made within the last few hours. Thunder rumbled in the distance as I followed the tracks with my eyes. They emerged from the dense forest to my left, crossed the trail, and disappeared into the undergrowth heading toward the lake, toward my cabin. The first heavy raindrops began to fall as I climbed back into the UTV. By the time I reached the station, the storm had arrived in full force, rain hammering the metal roof and wind howling through the pines. I quickly secured the vehicle and equipment, then made a dash for the cabin's porch. As I reached for the door handle, I glanced back toward the tree line where I'd seen movement that morning. For a split second, illuminated by a flash of lightning, I thought I saw a tall, dark figure standing among the pines, watching me. Then darkness returned, and it was gone. Inside, I peeled off my wet jacket and boots, trying to convince myself that exhaustion and poor light were playing tricks on my perception. I radioed in my return to dispatch, reported the cleared trails, and mentioned the unusual tracks I'd found. "Sounds like you've got yourself a Sasquatch, Rivers," the dispatcher laughed. "Better set out some bait if you want to catch it." "Very funny," I replied, though I couldn't muster much humor. "I'm sending photos. Have wildlife take a look, would you?" "Will do. Stay dry up there. Storm's supposed to clear by morning." After signing off, I built a fire in the small wood stove and prepared a simple dinner. The guest cabin would have to wait until tomorrow. As I ate, I found myself repeatedly glancing out the windows into the darkness, searching for, what? A creature from my grandfather's stories? I'd always prided myself on rational thinking, on scientific explanations for natural phenomena. Yet here I was, jumping at shadows and imagining monsters in the woods. I needed to get hold of myself before the researchers arrived. The last thing I wanted was to come across as some superstitious forest dweller spouting tales of woodland creatures. Still, as I prepared for bed that night, I checked that my revolver was loaded and within reach, and for the first time since taking the position at Nemetian Station, I locked the cabin door. Sleep came reluctantly, punctuated by vivid dreams of being pursued through endless forests by something I couldn't see but knew was there, always just behind me, always gaining ground. Each time I jerked awake, the storm still raged outside, and somewhere beneath the howling wind and pounding rain, I could have sworn I heard something moving around the cabin, testing the windows, searching for a way in. By morning, both the storm and my night terrors had passed. Sunlight streamed through the windows, revealing a peaceful scene that made my fears seem ridiculous in retrospect. I laughed at myself as I prepared breakfast. Wildlife encounters were part of the job, and after years of experience, I should know better than to let imagination run wild. After eating, I headed out to prepare the guest cabin for the arriving researchers. The small structure stood about 50 yards from my own quarters, positioned to offer privacy while remaining close enough for convenience and safety. It was a simple design, one room with 2 beds, a small kitchenette, and basic bathroom facilities. As I approached, I noticed immediately that something was wrong. The door stood ajar, though I was certain I'd secured it last fall. Inside, chaos greeted me. Bedding had been pulled from the mattresses, cabinet contents scattered across the floor, the small table overturned. My first thought was vandals, perhaps hikers who'd found the remote cabin and decided to leave their mark. But there had been no reports of anyone in the area, and the electronic trail register at the wilderness boundary hadn't recorded entries in weeks. Then I noticed the strange, musky scent I'd encountered on the trail the previous day. It permeated the cabin, stronger here in the enclosed space. And on the wooden floor, partially obscured by the scattered debris, were muddy prints, the same enormous, toe-distinguished impressions I'd photographed. Whatever had left those tracks on the trail had visited the guest cabin during the night. Not a bear rummaging for food, not vandals seeking thrills. Something else, something that moved with purpose. I backed out of the cabin, suddenly aware of how exposed I felt. The rational part of my mind insisted there must be a logical explanation, but another part, perhaps the part that had listened to my grandfather's stories, whispered that some things in these ancient forests defied conventional understanding. As I stood there, torn between conflicting instincts, my radio crackled to life. "Nemeshan Station, this is dispatch." I retrieved the radio from my belt with unsteady hands. "Go ahead, dispatch. Just got word your university visitors will be arriving earlier than expected. They're already on the access road. Should reach you within the hour." I looked back at the ransacked cabin, then at the surrounding forest that suddenly seemed full of watching eyes. "Copy that," I replied, my voice remarkably steady given the circumstances. "I'll be ready." But I wasn't ready. Not for what had happened during the night, and certainly not for what would follow in the days ahead. As I hurried back to my cabin to retrieve cleaning supplies, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed in my peaceful wilderness domain. Something had arrived at Lake Nemeshan, something that didn't appear in any wildlife management handbook or ranger training program, and it knew I was here. The researchers arrived just as I finished making the guest cabin presentable. I'd worked frantically to restore order, all the while trying to formulate a reasonable explanation for what had happened. Breaking and entering by wildlife seemed the most logical approach, though it didn't account for all the details. Their vehicle, a mud-splattered university-owned SUV, pulled up beside my cabin, and 2 figures emerged. The first was a tall, broad-shouldered man, with a wild mane of reddish hair and beard that made him look more like a Viking than an academic. The second was a slender woman, with dark skin and close-cropped black hair, moving with the precise efficiency of someone who valued function over form. "Ranger Rivers?" The woman approached with an outstretched hand. "I'm Dr. Maya Okalik. This is my colleague, Dr. Ian Donnelly." Her handshake was firm, her accent distinctly Canadian, specifically Inuit, I guessed, though I wasn't certain. "Welcome to Nemeshan Station," I replied, shaking hands with both of them. "Call me Kale. Everyone does." "G'day, mate," Donnelly said with an unmistakable Australian inflection that seemed at odds with his Norse appearance. "Beautiful spot you've got here. Reminds me of Tasmania minus the deadly everything." I helped them unload their surprisingly extensive equipment: cameras, recording devices, sample collection kits, and several unmarked metal cases that Dr. Okalik handled with particular care. "Your paperwork mentioned habitat studies," I said, curiosity getting the better of me. "What exactly are you researching?" The two exchanged a quick glance before Okalik answered. "We're conducting bioacoustic monitoring of wilderness environments," she said, "studying how sound propagates through different forest densities and what that tells us about ecosystem health." It sounded plausible enough, though it didn't explain all their equipment or why they'd chosen Nemeshan, one of the most remote stations in the system, for their work. "Interesting," I said, deciding not to press further for now. "Let me show you to your accommodations. Fair warning, we had some wildlife get into the guest cabin last night. I've cleaned up, but there might still be some disturbance." "What kind of wildlife?" Donnelly asked, suddenly alert. I hesitated. "Not entirely sure. Larger than a bear, based on the tracks. I took photos if you're interested." Again, that look between them. Brief but meaningful. We'd very much like to see those, Okalik said carefully. As we approached the guest cabin, I described finding the large footprints on the trail and later discovering the break-in. I deliberately avoided mentioning my more unusual observations, the feeling of being watched, the strange scent, the shadowy figure during the storm. No need to come across as unstable on first acquaintance. Inside the cabin, the researchers inspected the space with keen interest, particularly the areas where I'd pointed out the muddy prints before cleaning them. Shame we couldn't see the originals, Donnelly muttered, kneeling to examine a faint remnant I'd missed. I took photographs, I reminded him, pulling out my phone to show them. Both researchers studied the images with an intensity that seemed disproportionate to mere scientific curiosity. Okalik's expression remained neutral, but Donnelly's eyes widened appreciably. "Bloody hell," he whispered. "It's just like the Patterson-Gimlin prints." "The what?" I asked. Okalik shot him a warning look before turning to me with a carefully composed smile. "An old reference point in wildlife morphology," she explained smoothly. "These are fascinating tracks, Ranger Rivers. Would you mind sending us these images?" "Not at all," I said, though something about their reaction nagged at me. "And please, it's kale." After helping them settle in, I returned to my own cabin to prepare dinner. I'd invited them to join me, partly out of hospitality and partly because I was eager to learn more about my unexpected guests. As I chopped vegetables for a stew, my mind kept returning to Donnelly's comment and Okalik's quick intercession. Patterson-Gimlin wasn't a term I recognized from my wildlife management training. I opened my laptop and searched the phrase. The results were unexpected. Patterson-Gimlin referred to a famous, or infamous, film from 1967 purportedly showing a female Bigfoot walking along a creek bed in Northern California. The footage had been debated for decades by cryptozoologists and skeptics alike. These weren't ordinary wildlife researchers. They were Bigfoot hunters. The realization both amused and concerned me. On one hand, it explained their interest in the tracks and their elaborate equipment. On the other, it meant they'd been less than forthcoming about their true purpose here. When they arrived for dinner, I decided on a direct approach. "So," I said as I served the stew, "when were you planning to tell me you're looking for Sasquatch?" Donnelly choked on his first spoonful, while Okalik's expression flickered briefly before settling into resignation. "What gave us away?" she asked. "Patterson-Gimlin." I looked it up. I sat across from them at my small table. "Your university paperwork doesn't mention cryptozoology," Okalik sighed, "because it wouldn't have been approved if it did. Look, we are legitimate researchers. I have a PhD in evolutionary biology, and Ian is a wildlife biometrician. We're just exploring unconventional hypotheses. With university funding, the bioacoustic monitoring is real," Donnelly interjected, recovering from his surprise. "We're genuinely collecting that data. It's just not our only interest." I considered this as I ate. On a practical level, their actual research focus didn't much matter to me as long as they followed wilderness regulations and didn't disturb the environment. And if I were being honest, I was relieved their interest aligned with my recent experiences. It made me feel less like I was losing my grip on reality. "All right," I said finally. "I appreciate the honesty, and as it happens, you might find Nemesian particularly interesting at the moment." I proceeded to tell them everything: the sensation of being watched, the unnatural silence in the forest, the musky odor, and the shadowy figure during the storm. As I spoke, their initial embarrassment transformed into keen attention. "How long have you been stationed here?" Okalik asked when I finished. 3 seasons. This will be my 4th summer. "And you've never experienced anything like this before?" I shook my head. "Nothing this deliberate. We have all the usual wildlife, bears, moose, cougars, but they behave like animals. What I've been sensing feels different, intelligent." Donnelly leaned forward eagerly. "That tracks with reported encounters. Awareness of human presence, curiosity mixed with caution. Strategic movement patterns. These aren't simple animals. They're highly developed primates with sophisticated social structures. If they exist at all," Okalik added with scientific caution, though her expression suggested she believed they did. "What's brought you specifically to Nemesian?" I asked. "There must be hundreds of remote areas where a Bigfoot could potentially live." The researchers exchanged another of their communicative glances before Okalik answered. "We've been tracking reports across the Pacific Northwest for years. There's been a significant uptick in potential encounters in this region over the past 6 months. 3 hikers described a large bipedal creature near Morgan Creek, about 15 miles south of here. A wildlife photographer caught what might be a partial image near Twin Pines Ridge to the east. And the most compelling, a recording of unidentified vocalizations captured by a geological survey team just north of this lake." "What kind of vocalizations?" Donnelly pulled out his phone. Have a listen. He played an audio file that began with ordinary forest sounds, wind, birds, distant water. Then came a sound that raised the hair on my arms, a long, powerful howl that started low and rose in pitch before breaking into a series of staccato whoops. It wasn't a wolf or coyote or any animal call I recognized, and it certainly wasn't human. That was recorded 8 miles from where we're sitting, O'Callaghan said quietly as the recording ended. 2 months ago, we sat in silence for a moment, the implications settling around us like the gathering darkness outside. There's something else, I said finally. Something I haven't mentioned. I told them about my grandfather and his stories, tales of ancient beings who had lived in the mountains since the beginning of time. He called them the Old Ones, and described them as tall, powerful creatures covered in hair, with a deep connection to the natural world and a wariness of humans who had forgotten the old ways. In his stories, they weren't monsters, I explained. They were guardians of the wilderness, protectors of sacred places. They avoided humans when possible but would defend their territories when necessary. Many indigenous cultures have similar accounts. O'Callaghan nodded. My own people speak of the Tornet, tall, strong beings who once lived alongside us but retreated into the wilderness when humans became too numerous. The consistency across isolated cultural traditions is one of the most compelling arguments for their existence, Donnelly added. Aboriginal Australians have the Yowie, Himalayan peoples have the Yeti, North American tribes have Sasquatch or Wendigo, all describing remarkably similar creatures. So what's your theory? I asked. If these things are real, why haven't we found definitive proof? No bodies, no clear photographs, no DNA that can't be explained away as known species. That's what we're trying to understand, O'Callaghan replied. The most plausible hypothesis is that they're extremely rare, highly intelligent, and deliberately evasive. Think about it. A species with human-level intelligence but without our technological development would evolve exceptional skills for avoiding detection, especially if they've been hunted or threatened historically. Outside, darkness had fully descended, and with it came the nighttime symphony of the forest. Crickets, frogs, and the occasional distant owl. As if on cue, the sounds gradually diminished until an unnatural quiet settled around the cabin. We all noticed the change simultaneously. Donnelly moved to the window, peering out into the blackness. Something's out there, he whispered. I reached for my flashlight, but O'Callaghan caught my arm. Don't, she said softly. If it is what we think, light will drive it away. We sat in tense silence, listening intently. At first, there was nothing beyond the faint whisper of wind in the pines. Then came soft, deliberate footsteps circling the cabin, heavy enough to be heard but carefully placed, like someone trying to move quietly despite their size. It's the same pattern as last night, I murmured. Circling, testing. It's curious, O'Callaghan whispered. Assessing potential threat, the footsteps paused outside the window nearest to where we sat. I could feel a presence just beyond the glass, a consciousness evaluating us as thoroughly as we were trying to detect it. Then came a sound that froze my blood, a soft, rumbling vocalization somewhere between a growl and what I can only describe as speech. It wasn't random animal noise. It had structure, intentionality. Donnelly fumbled for his phone, presumably to record, but the movement seemed to startle our visitor. There was a quick series of heavy footsteps retreating from the cabin, branches breaking as something large moved rapidly through the underbrush, and then silence returned. We remained motionless for several long moments before O'Callaghan finally spoke. 3 years of research, and that's the closest I've ever been, she said, her voice tight with controlled excitement. It was right there. What do we do now? I asked, surprised at how steady my voice remained despite my racing heart. We set up our equipment, Donnelly replied, already standing. Tonight. If it returns, we need to be ready. The next few hours were a flurry of activity as the researchers unpacked their specialized gear. They explained each item as they worked: thermal imaging cameras, audio recording arrays designed to triangulate sound sources, motion sensors, and environmental sampling equipment to collect hair, saliva, or other biological materials. We're not trying to capture or harm it, O'Callaghan assured me, perhaps sensing my unease. Just document. Prove it exists. And if you do? I asked. What happens then? She paused in her work. That depends on how we handle the discovery. Ideally, we establish protections, recognize status as an endangered great ape species, habitat conservation, strictly controlled research access, and, less ideally, her expression darkened. Media circus, trophy hunters, habitat destruction by curiosity seekers. Is that why you're being secretive? Not just because people would think you're crackpots? Partly, she admitted, but mainly because we believe these creatures have survived, precisely because they've remained undiscovered. Exposure before proper protections are in place could be disastrous for them. By midnight, they had established a perimeter of sensors around both cabins and into the nearby forest. We agreed to take watches throughout the night. Donnelly first, then O'Callagh, with me taking the pre-dawn hours. Try to get some rest, O'Callagh advised as I headed back to my cabin. And Cale, thank you for your understanding. Most people in your position would have radioed for a psychiatric evaluation by now. I smiled. Let's just say my grandfather's stories prepared me to keep an open mind. Back in my own space, I found sleep elusive despite my exhaustion. Every creak of the cabin, every whisper of wind became magnified in my awareness. I'd encountered countless wild animals during my years as a ranger, faced down territorial bears and hungry wolves, navigated treacherous terrain in all weather conditions. None of it had affected me like the events of the past 2 days. Was it fear? Partly yes, but there was something else. A sense of standing at the threshold of discovery, of having the foundations of my understanding shifted. If O'Callagh and Donnelly were right, if the tracks and sounds and shadowy glimpses pointed to the existence of an undocumented hominid species, it would rewrite our understanding of evolutionary history. And on a more personal level, it would mean my grandfather's stories, dismissed by so many as mere folklore, contained profound truth. My watch came at 4 a.m. I relieved O'Callagh, who reported nothing unusual during her shift. The monitoring equipment showed only expected wildlife movements, deer coming to the lake to drink, nocturnal rodents going about their business. The eastern sky was just beginning to lighten when one of the thermal sensors at the edge of their array triggered an alert. I watched the monitor as a large heat signature moved slowly along the lakeshore, well beyond normal human height. Dr. O'Callagh, Dr. Donnelly, I called quietly. We've got something. They emerged from the guest cabin quickly, still wearing their clothes from the previous day. Donnelly took control of the monitoring equipment while O'Callagh grabbed a high-powered spotting scope. Location? She asked tersely. Northeastern shoreline. Moving south, I replied. About 600 yards out, Donnelly adjusted the directional microphones, and a faint sound came through the speakers. Rhythmic splashing, like something walking through the shallow water at the lake's edge. It's using the water to mask its scent and footprints, he murmured. Clever. Through the scope, O'Callagh tracked the heat signature as it moved. Dawn was breaking rapidly now, the forest emerging from darkness into the gray half-light that precedes sunrise. I've got visual, she whispered excitedly. Bipedal, approximately 8 feet tall, consistent with reported morphology. She offered me the scope. With slightly trembling hands, I looked through the eyepiece and adjusted the focus. There, moving along the far shore with smooth, powerful strides, was a figure unlike anything I'd seen before, tall and broad-shouldered, covered in dark hair or fur. It moved with a fluid grace that belied its massive size. Its arms swung longer than a human's would, occasionally touching the ground or grasping at vegetation as it passed. As I watched, it paused, then slowly turned its head toward us. Even at this distance, I could sense its awareness. It knew exactly where we were. For a moment that seemed to stretch into infinity, we observed each other across the expanse of the lake. Then, with deliberate purpose, it raised an arm and appeared to gesture toward the mountains behind it before melting into the forest with shocking speed for something so large. Did you see that? I gasped, lowering the scope. It gestured. O'Callagh confirmed, her voice tight with excitement. Complex communication behavior. Donnelly was already reviewing the thermal footage. We've got it recorded. Not high-resolution visible light, but definitive thermal imaging of a large bipedal subject moving in a non-human gait pattern. It was showing us something, I said, still processing what I'd witnessed, pointing toward the mountains, or warning us away from them. O'Callagh suggested. We spent the morning reviewing the data they'd collected. Thermal images, audio recordings, and measurements calculated from the visual reference points. Everything supported the presence of an organism matching reported Sasquatch characteristics. It's not conclusive proof, O'Callagh cautioned as we examined the evidence. But it's the best documentation I've seen in years of research. What now? I asked. More monitoring? Absolutely, Donnelly nodded. But we should also explore where it was directing our attention. Those ridges to the northeast, is there anything significant up there? I considered the question. There's an area locals call the Echo Valley about 4 miles in that direction. Old-growth forest, some caves formed by ancient lava tubes. It's off the marked trails, so it sees very little human traffic. Perfect Sasquatch habitat, Donnelly mused. Shelter, seclusion, likely water sources. It's rough terrain, I warned. And if there is something up there that doesn't want company, all the more reason to investigate carefully, O'Callagh finished. We'll need your guidance, Cale. Would you be willing to take us there tomorrow? I hesitated. My ranger duties technically covered trail maintenance and visitor safety, not escorting Bigfoot researchers on speculative expeditions, yet my curiosity was thoroughly piqued, and as the local authority, I justified that investigating unusual activity in the wilderness was within my purview. "I'll take you," I agreed. "But we go prepared, move carefully, and at the first sign of danger we retreat." No arguments. They readily agreed to my terms, and we spent the remainder of the day preparing for the expedition. I plotted our route, ensuring we had alternate paths for both ascent and descent if needed. The researchers gathered their portable recording equipment and sample collection materials. That evening, as we finalized our preparations, I found myself remembering more of my grandfather's stories, particularly his warnings about respecting the domains of the old ones. "They watch from the high places," he would say, his weathered face solemn in the firelight. "Those who enter their sacred grounds uninvited may never return to tell what they found." As a child, such tales had thrilled and frightened me. As an adult, I dismissed them as cautionary fables designed to keep curious children from wandering too far. Now, I wasn't so sure. After the researchers returned to their cabin, I sat alone on my porch, watching darkness claim the forest once more. The lake reflected a sky brilliant with stars, the Milky Way stretching across the heavens like a river of light. In such moments, the modern world with its certainties and scientific classifications seemed very far away. What if we were wrong about so many things? What if the natural world contained mysteries that had evaded our instruments and methodologies precisely because they existed at the edges of our understanding? As if in answer to my unspoken questions, a long, mournful call echoed across the lake, the same haunting vocalization we'd heard on Donnelly's recording, but closer now, more powerful. It reverberated through the trees and seemed to penetrate directly into my chest, ancient and wild and utterly beyond human experience. From the guest cabin I heard excited movement as the researchers presumably scrambled to document the sound, but I remained motionless, letting the call wash over me, speaking to something primal in my own consciousness. It wasn't a warning or a threat, it was a proclamation, a reminder that these mountains and forests existed long before humans named and claimed them, and would endure long after our brief stewardship ended. Whatever awaited us in Echo Valley, I knew with sudden clarity that we weren't the discoverers here. We were the discovered, assessed and permitted to proceed, or not, according to judgments we could barely comprehend. The call faded gradually, leaving behind a profound silence filled with possibility and danger in equal measure. Tomorrow would bring us face to face with something that had persisted at the margins of human awareness for centuries. I just hoped we were ready for what we would find. Dawn broke with unsettling serenity, as if the forest were deliberately withholding its secrets in the growing light. We set out early, the three of us moving in silent procession along the lake's edge before turning northeast toward the distant ridgeline. I led the way, rifle slung across my back, a precaution I'd insisted upon despite O'Collick's concerns about appearing threatening. "It's not just for the Sasquatch," I'd explained. "There are more conventional predators out there too." The terrain grew steadily more challenging as we left the established trails behind. Ancient trees created a cathedral-like canopy that filtered the sunlight into dappled patterns on the forest floor. Moss-covered logs and tumbled boulders testified to centuries of growth, decay, and geological upheaval. In places we had to navigate ravines choked with devil's club and stinging nettle, their thorns and irritants an effective deterrent to casual exploration. Donnelly proved surprisingly adept in the wilderness, for an academic, moving with the sure-footed confidence of someone who'd spent considerable time in rough country. O'Collick was methodical and determined, pausing occasionally to collect samples or take readings from her various instruments. "The ecosystem here is remarkably undisturbed," she noted as we rested beside a clear mountain stream. "Some of these trees must be over 500 years old. The terrain has protected it," I explained. "Too difficult for logging operations, too remote for tourism development. One of the few truly wild places left. Perfect refuge," Donnelly murmured, scanning the dense undergrowth that surrounded us. "If you needed to avoid human detection, you couldn't design a better habitat." We continued upward, the slope growing steeper as we approached Echo Valley. The forest thinned somewhat at higher elevation, replaced by jumbles of volcanic rock interspersed with hardy pines that thrived in the thin soil. The air grew noticeably cooler, carrying the mineral scent of distant snow still clinging to the highest peaks. It was nearly noon when we crested a final rise and Echo Valley spread before us, a natural amphitheater of steep walls embracing a bowl of vibrant green meadow bisected by a meandering stream. At the valley's far end, dark openings in the rock face marked the entrance to the lava tube system I'd mentioned. "It's beautiful," O'Collick breathed, "completely sheltered from view until you're right upon it." We descended carefully into the valley, all senses alert for any sign of unusual activity. The meadow grass showed game trails, deer and elk primarily, but I noted areas where the vegetation was crushed in patterns inconsistent with four-legged animals. These disturbances formed rough paths leading toward the cave entrances. As we neared the stream, Donnelly suddenly raised his hand in a silent signal to stop. He pointed to a muddy section of the bank where a series of clear footprints were impressed in the soft earth. The same distinctive tracks we'd seen near the cabin, but fresher. "Recent," he whispered, kneeling to examine them more closely. Within the last few hours, O'Callagh removed a casting kit from her pack and quickly created plaster molds of several prints while Donnelly photographed the area extensively. I stood guard, rifle at the ready, eyes constantly sweeping our surroundings. Despite the bright sunshine and open meadow, I couldn't shake the feeling of being observed. "The stride length is consistent with a creature approximately 8 feet tall," O'Callagh reported as she packed away her samples. "And look here, toe flexibility and pressure distribution indicating significant dexterity and adaptability to rough terrain. There are multiple sets," Donnelly added, gesturing to overlapping tracks. "At least 3 distinct individuals based on size variation." The implications settled uneasily in my mind. Not a lone creature, but multiple beings moving purposefully through this hidden valley. A family group? A community? "The caves are the logical next step," O'Callagh suggested, gazing toward the dark openings in the distance. I hesitated. If these are intelligent beings with a social structure, those caves might be their home. Entering would be an intrusion. "We'll be respectful," she assured me. "Observe only, from the entrance if possible. No deep exploration without clear signs it's safe to proceed." Reluctantly, I agreed, and we continued across the meadow toward the cave system. As we approached, the entrances resolved into 3 distinct openings of varying sizes. The largest was easily 15 feet high, a yawning portal into darkness that seemed to swallow the sunlight. The area around the entrances showed clear signs of regular use: packed earth, broken branches arranged in patterns too deliberate to be natural, and most tellingly, a collection of large bones stacked neatly to one side of the main opening. Examination showed them to be predominantly deer and elk, with some smaller mammals mixed in. "Food remains," Donnelly whispered, "but organized, not scattered like you'd see at a predator's den." O'Callagh knelt beside a flat stone positioned near the entrance. Its surface bore dark stains and deep scoring marks. "Cutting tool marks," she murmured. "They're processing their food." The evidence of tool use and organizational behavior sent a shiver down my spine. These weren't simple animals operating on instinct. Whatever lived here demonstrated complex, learned behaviors passed down through observation and instruction. We approached the main cave entrance cautiously. The temperature dropped noticeably as we neared the opening, cool air flowing outward in a gentle but persistent current. Strange, musty odors wafted from within, the familiar musky scent I'd encountered before, but also wood smoke, decaying vegetation, and something else I couldn't identify. Donnelly set up a powerful lantern that cast light several yards into the cave, revealing a wide, smooth-floored passage that curved gradually leftward before disappearing into darkness. The walls showed signs of both natural formation and deliberate modification. Areas smoothed by tools, niches carved into the rock that held various objects, stones of unusual shapes and colors, feathers, animal bones, and what appeared to be crude implements fashioned from wood and stone. "This is beyond anything we've documented," O'Callagh said, her voice barely audible. "Evidence of material culture, tool use, possibly ritual objects." She was reaching for her camera when a sound froze us in place. A low, rhythmic thumping emanating from deep within the cave system. It wasn't mechanical but rather organic, like large hands beating against hollow logs or stone. The rhythm was complex, changing in ways that suggested communication rather than random noise. "It's a warning," I said instinctively, though I couldn't have explained how I knew. As if confirming my interpretation, a powerful vocalization followed the drumming, the now familiar howl breaking into whoops, but this time with distinct variations and patterns. It echoed through the cave and across the valley, amplified by the natural acoustics of the rock walls. "They're speaking," Donnelly whispered in awe. Complex vocalization consistent with rudimentary language. "We should leave," I urged, the hair on my neck rising. "We've seen enough. They know we're here, and they're telling us to go." O'Callagh hesitated, clearly torn between scientific opportunity and personal safety. "Just a few photographs of the cultural artifacts. Quick documentation, then we'll retreat." Before I could object further, the rhythmic thumping stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was more terrifying than any sound could have been. Then came heavy footsteps from within the cave, moving toward us with deliberate purpose. "Out. Now," I commanded, backing away from the entrance while keeping my rifle lowered but ready. The researchers finally heeded my warning, gathering their equipment with hasty movements. We retreated about 50 yards from the cave entrance, putting a large boulder between us and whatever was emerging. Peering cautiously around our shelter, we watched as a massive figure appeared at the cave mouth, taller than any human, heavily muscled and covered in dark reddish-brown hair. It stood upright on two legs but occasionally rested its long arms on the ground, knuckles touching the earth in a manner reminiscent of gorillas. Its face was the most striking feature, a broad, flattened nose, heavy brow ridge, and deep-set eyes that gleamed with unmistakable intelligence. The creature surveyed the area methodically, head turning to scan each section of the meadow before focusing directly on our position. It knew exactly where we were. A second figure appeared beside the first, slightly smaller but with similar features, perhaps female to the first one's male. They communicated with short guttural vocalizations and hand gestures, clearly discussing our presence and how to respond. "They're deciding whether we're a threat," Okalik whispered, her scientific detachment warring with very human fear. The creatures continued their consultation for several minutes while we remained frozen in place. Then, with startling decisiveness, the larger one strode forward into the meadow, covering ground with long, powerful steps. It stopped about halfway between the cave and our position, straightened to its full height, easily 8 feet tall, and pounded its chest with alternating fists. The sound echoed across the valley, a demonstration of strength that needed no translation. Then it extended one massive arm, pointing first at us, then emphatically back the way we had come. The message couldn't have been clearer. "Leave. Now. We need to go," I said quietly. No sudden movements. Back away slowly, maintaining eye contact but not directly staring. We began our careful retreat, moving backward up the slope we had descended earlier. The creature remained motionless, watching our withdrawal with unsettling focus. When we reached the ridgeline that marked the valley's edge, it finally turned and loped back to the cave entrance with surprising speed and grace for something so large. We continued our retreat for another half-mile before stopping to process what we'd witnessed. "That was extraordinary," Donnelly breathed, his hands shaking as he checked the camera he'd somehow managed to use during our encounter. "Direct interaction with an undocumented hominid species. Did you get any recordings?" Okalik nodded, her scientific composure returning. "Audio and some basic thermal imaging. Not high resolution from this distance, but corroborating evidence at minimum." "They let us go," I said, still trying to reconcile what I'd seen with my understanding of the natural world. They could have attacked. We were outnumbered, and they clearly had the physical advantage, but they chose to warn us off instead. "Conflict avoidance," Okalik suggested, consistent with a species that's survived alongside humans by minimizing direct confrontation. "But the warning was clear," I insisted. "They've established a boundary. I don't think we should test it again." The researchers exchanged looks, clearly reluctant to abandon such a rich research opportunity. But the encounter had shaken them enough that they didn't immediately argue. "Let's get back to the station," Donnelly suggested. "Review what we've collected, develop a more comprehensive approach." The return journey felt much longer than our morning hike. Every shadow among the trees, every snapping twig or rustling leaf, heightened our awareness of being in territory that wasn't truly ours. The wilderness I'd thought I knew intimately had revealed itself to be home to beings I'd believed existed only in folklore. We were perhaps 2 miles from the station when Okalik, who had been consulting one of her instruments, suddenly stopped. "Something's following us," she said quietly. 300 yards back, moving parallel to our trail. Donnelly checked the thermal imaging device. "Confirmed. Large heat signature, bipedal movement pattern. One of them is tracking us," I murmured, making sure we're leaving as instructed. We continued at a steady pace, neither rushing nor dawdling, as if to demonstrate our compliance with the unspoken agreement. Our shadow maintained its distance, occasionally visible as a dark shape moving through the trees when the foliage thinned. The sun was setting by the time we reached the lake, casting long shadows across the water. As we emerged from the forest onto the shoreline path, I glanced back one last time. There, at the edge of the tree line, stood our follower, a silhouette against the gathering darkness. It raised one arm in what seemed almost like a farewell gesture, then melted back into the forest. At the cabins, we collapsed into chairs on my porch, exhausted physically and emotionally by the day's events. For several minutes, no one spoke, each of us privately processing what we had witnessed. "What now?" I finally asked, breaking the silence. Okalik looked thoughtful. "We have preliminary evidence of an undocumented hominid species with complex social structures, tool use, possible language, and territorial behaviors. Under normal circumstances, this would justify a major scientific expedition." "But these aren't normal circumstances," Donnelly finished. "These beings have clearly demonstrated their desire for privacy. Invading their territory with a large research team could provoke conflict, not to mention the broader implications, I added. Once word gets out, this place would be overrun with curiosity seekers, media, potential trophy hunters. Their way of life would be destroyed. The ethical dilemma hung in the air between us. As scientists, they had discovered something that could rewrite our understanding of hominid evolution and validate decades of dismissed research. As human beings, they recognized the moral complexity of forcing contact on beings that clearly wished to remain hidden. Perhaps there's a middle path, Okalik suggested, after lengthy consideration. We document what we've seen, secure independent verification from trusted colleagues, and simultaneously work to establish legal protections for this area before making any public announcements. That could take years, Donnelly pointed out. Yes, she agreed. But these beings have remained undiscovered for centuries. A few more years to ensure their safety seems reasonable. I found myself appreciating their thoughtfulness. They weren't trophy hunters seeking fame at any cost, but genuine researchers wrestling with the profound responsibility their discovery entailed. Whatever you decide, I said, I need to report this to my supervisors. Unusual activity in my jurisdiction. Potential visitor safety concerns. I can't keep this completely quiet. We understand, Okalik nodded. But perhaps we can collaborate on how the information is presented. Frame it as unverified sightings of unusual wildlife. Requests for increased patrol presence rather than public alerts that would draw attention. It seemed a reasonable compromise. We agreed to spend one more day at the station, compiling our observations and evidence into organized reports, before heading back to civilization to begin the delicate process of verification and protection. Later that night, after the researchers retired to their cabin, I sat alone beside the lake, watching moonlight ripple across the water. The day's encounters had fundamentally shifted my perspective on the wilderness I thought I knew. These ancient forests were not merely resources to be managed or playgrounds for human recreation, but homes to beings with their own societies, their own ways of understanding the world. My grandfather's stories, dismissed as fantasy by my educated adult self, now seemed like vital cultural knowledge passed down through generations, warnings and wisdom about coexisting with the other inhabitants of these mountains. From across the water came a now familiar call, the haunting vocalization that seemed to bridge the gap between animal sound and human speech. It echoed between the mountain peaks, answered by another call from a different direction, then another. They were communicating, discussing perhaps the strange humans who had entered their territory and been allowed to leave, deciding, maybe, whether we could be trusted with the knowledge of their existence. I hoped we could prove worthy of that trust. Morning brought heavy fog that clung to the lake and wound through the trees like ghostly fingers. The world beyond my porch disappeared into swirling white, creating an unsettling sense of isolation. Even the reliable sounds of forest birds were muted, as if the wilderness itself were holding its breath. I was finishing my coffee when a sharp knock at my door announced Donnelly's arrival. His usual exuberance had been replaced by tense anxiety. Maya's missing, he said without preamble. What do you mean missing? She went out before dawn to check the perimeter sensors. Said she'd be back in 20 minutes. That was 2 hours ago. Cold dread settled in my stomach. Did she say which direction she was heading? Northeast, toward where we picked up activity yesterday. I've tried radioing, but there's no response. I grabbed my gear without hesitation. Radio, first aid kit, GPS unit, rifle. Show me which way she went. Outside, the fog rendered visibility to mere yards. Donnelly led me to the edge of the clearing where a faint trail of footprints was barely visible in the damp earth, heading into the forest toward Echo Valley. Why would she go back there alone? I muttered, more to myself than Donnelly. After yesterday's warning, she was excited about the documentation we gathered, he replied, his Australian accent thickening with worry. Said something about getting clearer audio recordings of morning vocalizations when they might be most active. I keyed my radio. Dr. Okalik, this is Ranger Rivers. Please respond. Static was the only reply. I tried twice more with the same result. The mountains sometimes block transmission, I explained, though we both knew that didn't fully account for the silence. Let's follow her trail as far as we can in this fog. If we haven't found her by the time visibility improves, I'll call for backup. The tracking was difficult in the misty conditions. Okalik had clearly tried to be careful, but occasional broken twigs and disturbed undergrowth confirmed her passage. She had indeed been heading back toward Echo Valley, though whether she intended to reach the caves or merely set up recording equipment at a safe distance wasn't clear. We'd been following her trail for nearly an hour when Donnelly spotted something caught on a thorny bush, a small scrap of fabric that matched Okalik's jacket. Beyond it, the signs of her passage became more erratic, with wider spaces between identifiable tracks and increasing disturbance to the surrounding vegetation. She was moving faster here, I observed, examining broken branches that hung askew. Running, possibly. Donnelly's face paled. From what? The question lingered unanswered as we pressed forward, now moving with greater caution. The fog was beginning to lift, allowing glimpses of the terrain ahead. We were on the lower slopes leading up to Echo Valley, but still a good mile from the ridge that overlooked the meadow. I was about to suggest calling in additional rangers when a sound stopped us cold. A high, thin cry that echoed briefly before being cut short. Human, unmistakably, and filled with fear. "Maya!" Donnelly shouted, surging forward before I could stop him. "Wait!" I called, but he was already crashing through the underbrush in the direction of the cry. Cursing under my breath, I raced after him, trying to balance speed with necessary caution. We burst into a small clearing to find Okalik's equipment scattered across the ground, her backpack torn open, contents strewn about, recording devices smashed. Of Okalik herself, there was no sign, but a clear trail of massive footprints and disturbed earth led away from the scene, heading deeper into the forest. "They've taken her," Donnelly whispered, face ashen as he knelt beside her destroyed equipment. I assessed the scene carefully. It doesn't make sense. They let us leave peacefully yesterday. Why take aggressive action now? Maybe she got too close. Maybe they saw her equipment as threatening. He picked up a shattered audio recorder. "We have to find her." "We need backup," I insisted, reaching for my radio. "This is beyond what the two of us can handle safely. By the time help arrives, it could be too late." Donnelly's voice cracked with emotion. "These creatures are intelligent but unpredictable. If they perceive her as a threat," he didn't finish the thought, but he didn't need to. We both understood the potential danger Okalik faced if her captors decided she represented a risk to their security. I made a quick decision. "I'll call for support to be ready at the station, but we'll continue tracking while we wait. Stay close to me, follow my lead, and if I say we pull back, we pull back. No arguments." Donnelly nodded grimly, and I made the call to dispatch, keeping my explanation deliberately vague. A researcher had gone missing, possible wildlife involvement, requesting standby support. I didn't mention Sasquatch or kidnapping, but would either delay help with psychiatric evaluations or bring a circus of attention we couldn't afford. The trail left by Okalik's captors was clear despite their apparent attempt to minimize signs of passage. Broken branches, disturbed earth, and occasional clear footprints marked their route. But strangely, they weren't heading toward Echo Valley. Instead, they were moving westward, parallel to the lake but deeper in the forest than the usual trails. "They're not taking her to the caves," I noted as we followed cautiously. "They're heading somewhere else. Is there anything in that direction? Another shelter, another valley?" I consulted my mental map of the area. There's a series of ridges, some old-growth forest that survived the wildfires 30 years ago. No marked trails or known features of interest. "Unknown to humans, maybe," Donnelly muttered. We continued for another mile, the forest growing denser and more primeval as we moved into an area I had rarely patrolled. Ancient trees towered overhead, their massive trunks covered in thick moss, roots creating natural archways and hollows. The ground grew increasingly rugged, with sharp upthrusts of volcanic rock breaking through the soil like the bones of the earth itself. The trail suddenly disappeared at the base of a near-vertical rock face some 40 feet high. No footprints continued in either direction along its base. "Did they climb?" Donnelly asked, examining the rough surface. "With a struggling human captive? Unlikely." I scanned the rock face carefully, looking for any sign of passage. My eye caught a subtle shadow that didn't match the surrounding patterns, a dark recess partially hidden by hanging vines and roots. "There," I pointed. "I think it's an opening." We approached cautiously. Pulling aside the curtain of vegetation revealed a narrow fissure in the rock, just wide enough for a human to squeeze through sideways. Cool air flowed outward, carrying that now familiar musky scent along with the mineral smell of wet stone. "Another cave system," Donnelly whispered. "Not on any of your maps?" I shook my head. "Completely unknown, at least officially." From beyond the opening came a sound that froze my blood. Okalik's voice, distant but clear, calling Donnelly's name. She was alive. Donnelly immediately moved toward the entrance, but I caught his arm. "Wait," I cautioned. "This could be more complex than it appears. If they wanted to harm her, they could have done so where they found her. The fact that they brought her here suggests something else is happening." "Like what? A hostage situation?" His voice was taut with strain. "I don't know. But rushing in blindly won't help her." I pulled a powerful flashlight from my pack. "We go slowly, quietly, and together. Understand?" He nodded reluctantly, and we slipped through the narrow entrance into darkness. The passage widened immediately beyond the fissure, opening into a tunnel large enough for us to walk upright. The floor sloped gently downward, worn smooth by what must have been centuries of use. My flashlight revealed walls marked with ochre and black pigments in patterns too deliberate to be natural. Handprints, animal figures, and abstract symbols that stirred something in my memory. "These are pictographs," I whispered. "Ancient rock art." "How ancient?" Donnelly asked, his scientific curiosity momentarily overriding his concern for Ocalic. "Some similar ones in this region have been dated to over 3,000 years old." I moved the light slowly across the images. "But these look maintained, renewed." We continued deeper into the cave system, the passage occasionally branching or opening into larger chambers before narrowing again. Throughout, the walls bore similar markings, growing more elaborate as we progressed. Some depicted recognizable animals: deer, eagle, bear, while others showed tall, broad-shouldered figures that could only be representations of the beings we had encountered. The air grew warmer, more humid, and the sound of flowing water reached us from somewhere ahead. We rounded a final bend and emerged into a vast cavern illuminated by an eerie, phosphorescent blue-green light emanating from patches of fungus or lichen growing on the walls and ceiling. At the center of the chamber was a pool of clear water fed by a small waterfall bursting from the rock face. The pool drained away into another passage, creating a stream that disappeared into the darkness. Around this natural feature, the cave floor had been modified into distinct living areas, raised platforms covered with woven mats of plant material, niches carved into the walls holding various artifacts, and what appeared to be designated spaces for food preparation and tool making. And there, seated on a stone dais near the pool, was Dr. Maya Ocalic, alive, apparently unharmed, and deep in conversation with three of the creatures we had come to think of as Sasquatch. She wasn't bound or restrained in any way. Instead, she sat cross-legged, notebook open on her lap, hands moving in expressive gestures as she communicated with the beings around her. One, the large male we had seen the previous day, responded with similar hand movements interspersed with soft vocalizations. "She's talking with them," Donnelly breathed in astonishment. At the sound of his voice, all heads turned in our direction. The largest creature rose to its full height, an imposing figure in the strange blue light, but made no aggressive move. Ocalic quickly stood and called out to us. "Ian, Kale, it's okay. They're not hostile. They brought me here to communicate." We approached, cautiously, still uncertain of our welcome. As we drew closer, I noticed more details of the beings we were encountering. Their hair-covered bodies revealed subtle variations in coloration and facial features. The presumed male had streaks of silver in his otherwise dark pelage, while the smaller female's coat had a reddish tint. The third, smaller than the others, appeared juvenile. "This is extraordinary," Donnelly murmured, eyes wide with wonder. "A completely undocumented social group with complex cultural behaviors." Ocalic gestured for us to join her, her expression a mixture of excitement and awe. "They've been trying to communicate with us since we arrived," she explained rapidly. "The destroyed equipment wasn't an attack. They were examining it and didn't understand its fragility. When they realized I was alone, they decided to bring me here, to show me." "Show you what?" I asked, still keeping a cautious distance from our hosts. "Their home, their history." She gestured to the pictographs that covered the walls of the main chamber. "They've been here for thousands of years, living alongside humans but separate, watching our development, our expansion." "How are you communicating?" Donnelly asked, his scientific curiosity fully engaged despite the bizarre circumstances. "Combination of sign language, drawings, and some vocalizations I'm starting to recognize. They're incredibly intelligent, Ian. They have a complex language of their own, and some of them have learned to understand human speech, though their vocal anatomy prevents them from reproducing it precisely." The largest of the creatures, the silverback as I found myself thinking of him, moved forward with deliberate slowness, stopping a few feet from where we stood. His deep-set eyes studied us with undeniable intelligence, assessing our reactions and demeanor. Then, with movements that seemed practiced but not entirely natural, he raised his hands and formed distinct signs that even I could recognize as American Sign Language. "Friend. Welcome. Peace." Donnelly gasped. "They've adapted human sign language?" "Selectively," Ocalic nodded. "They've observed human behavior for generations, learning what they could from a distance. They know multiple human languages but primarily use their own communication systems." The silverback signed again. "Why here? Why now?" Ocalic turned to us. "They want to know why we've come to their territory now, after so long avoiding direct contact." I thought about my grandfather's stories, about the traditions that spoke of these beings as guardians of wild places. Ask them if humans once knew them better in the past. She relayed the question through signs and gestures. The silverback nodded, a surprisingly human motion, and responded with an elaborate series of signs that Okalik struggled to translate completely. Long ago, humans and, I think forest people is the closest translation, lived with understanding. Humans brought gifts, showed respect. Forest people protected sacred places, kept dangerous spirits away. She paused as he continued signing. Then new humans came, with loud weapons and no respect. Forest people retreated deeper into the mountains, avoided all humans. European colonization, Donnelly whispered. The displacement of indigenous cultures disrupted the previous equilibrium. The silverback continued his communication, becoming more animated. Okalik translated haltingly, now humans everywhere. Cut trees, bring loud machines, no safety for forest people. Some family groups gone, only few remain. He gestured to the small group around him. We watch, we listen, we decide. Decide what? I asked. The answer came with solemn gravity. If humans can be trusted again. The implication was clear. They had revealed themselves to us deliberately, a test to see how we would respond to their existence. Whether we would respect their privacy and territory or exploit our discovery for personal gain. Ask them why they chose us, Donnelly suggested. Why now? Why here? After relaying the question, Okalik translated the response. You, the silverback pointed at me, have old blood, old knowledge. Grandfather taught you. We watched many seasons. You protect forest, not destroy. I felt a chill run through me. They had been observing me for years, evaluating my behavior, my stewardship of the wilderness, and somehow they knew about my grandfather, about the stories he had passed down to me. And us? Donnelly asked, indicating himself and Okalik. You search for truth, not for killing, not for fame. We heard your words at Fire Circle. The silverback mimicked sitting around a campfire. You spoke of protection, of keeping forest people safe from bad humans. They had been close enough to our cabins to overhear our conversations, close enough to understand our intentions, and judge them worthy of this unprecedented contact. For the next several hours, we engaged in the most extraordinary exchange of information. Through Okalik's increasingly fluid translation, we learned fragments of their history, their perception of human development, and their current challenges. In return, we explained our research, our desire to document their existence while ensuring their protection. The juvenile seemed particularly fascinated by our equipment, especially my camera. With the silverback's permission, I demonstrated how it worked, showing them the digital images I captured. The concept of creating permanent images clearly wasn't new to them. The pictographs throughout the cave system proved that, but the immediacy of digital photography elicited sounds of what I interpreted as appreciation or wonder. As our unprecedented meeting continued, I found myself reassessing everything I thought I knew about the natural world and humanity's place within it. These beings weren't simply undiscovered primates, but intelligent, culture-bearing people with their own history, language, and understanding of the world, a parallel development of consciousness that had remained hidden alongside our own. Eventually, the quality of light from the cave entrance began to change, indicating the approaching sunset. The silverback noticed this and communicated something to Okalik that made her expression grow serious. They say we must leave before dark, she translated. Other forest people are coming, from different family groups. Some don't agree with talking to humans. Could be dangerous. Different groups have different attitudes toward humans? Donnelly asked. Yes. This group, they call themselves something like river watchers, are more open to limited contact. Others have suffered more from human expansion, hunting, habitat destruction. They're hostile to any human presence. The urgency of departure became clear as distant vocalizations echoed through the cave system, calls similar to those we'd heard before, but with harsher, more aggressive tones. We need to go, I said, gathering our equipment. Now, the silverback nodded in agreement and gestured for us to follow him. Rather than returning the way we had come, he led us through a different passage that gradually sloped upward. After several minutes of climbing, we emerged from a well-concealed exit onto a forested slope, with a view of the lake in the distance. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the landscape. Our guide pointed toward the distant lights of the ranger station, then made a sweeping gesture that encompassed the surrounding wilderness, before pointing to his chest and those of his family members. The message needed no translation. This is our home. Respect it. With a final acknowledging nod to each of us, the silverback and his family melted into the gathering darkness with astonishing silence for beings of such size. We made our way back to the station in contemplative silence, each processing the profound implications of our encounter. It was fully dark by the time we reached the cabins, guided by the beam of my flashlight and the occasional glimpse of stars through the forest canopy. As we approached the clearing, I noticed unusual lights. the unmistakable red and blue flashing of emergency vehicles. Looks like dispatch sent that backup after all, I murmured. This is going to be complicated. 2 Forest Service trucks and a Sheriff's Department SUV were parked in front of my cabin. As we emerged from the trees, several figures moved toward us, flashlights sweeping in our direction. "Ranger Rivers," called a familiar voice. Jack Peterson, my direct supervisor from regional headquarters. "Where the hell have you been? We've been trying to reach you for hours." "Sorry, sir," I replied, thinking quickly. "We were in a search area with poor radio reception. Dr. O'Callaghan wandered off trail this morning, and we've been tracking her. Found her about 2 miles northeast, slightly disoriented but unharmed." O'Callaghan picked up my cue smoothly. "Yes, entirely my fault. I was recording bird vocalizations and lost track of time and direction. So embarrassing to have caused such concern." Peterson seemed skeptical but didn't press immediately. "Well, you've got everyone worried sick. Sheriff's Department was about to organize a full search party. Completely unnecessary now," Donnelly chimed in with forced cheerfulness. "All's well that ends well, eh?" As the emergency responders packed up, reassured that the situation was resolved, Peterson pulled me aside. "Rivers, what's really going on up here?" "Dispatch said something about destroyed equipment and possible wildlife involvement. Then we arrive and find sophisticated monitoring gear set up around your cabins." He gestured toward the sensors the researchers had installed. "This doesn't look like standard ornithological research to me." I chose my words carefully. "The researchers are conducting some specialized environmental monitoring. As for the damaged equipment, Dr. O'Callaghan believes it was likely a curious bear. Nothing that warrants ongoing concern." He studied me for a long moment. "You know, there have been strange reports from this area for years. Hikers hearing unusual sounds, glimpsing large figures in the forest. Most of us write it off as imagination or misidentified wildlife. But you've always struck me as a no-nonsense type, Rivers." "I appreciate that, sir. So I'll ask you directly. Is there something in these woods that headquarters should know about? Something that might represent a threat to visitors or staff?" I met his gaze steadily. "No threat, sir, as long as visitors respect wilderness regulations and stay on marked trails. The backcountry here is remote and challenging. People need to be properly prepared and follow established guidelines." It wasn't a direct answer to his question, but it wasn't a lie either. The beings we had encountered posed no danger to humans who respected their territory. Peterson seemed to accept this, though his expression suggested he knew I was withholding something. "All right, Rivers, I trust your judgment, but I want daily check-ins from now on, and immediate notification of any unusual incidents." "Yes, sir." "Understood." After the official vehicles departed, the 3 of us gathered in my cabin, the weight of our shared secret creating a new bond between us. "What do we do now?" Donnelly asked, breaking the silence. "We have evidence of a previously undocumented hominid species with complex language, social structures, and cultural behaviors. This could be the most significant anthropological discovery of the century, or a catastrophe for them if handled badly," O'Callaghan countered. "If their existence becomes public knowledge before proper protections are in place, their way of life could be destroyed overnight." I considered the trust that had been placed in us, not just by the beings we now knew existed, but by my grandfather and all those who had preserved the knowledge of these forest people through generations of stories dismissed as mere folklore. "I think we need to honor the choice they've made," I said finally. "They revealed themselves to us deliberately, testing whether humans could be trusted again after generations of conflict and avoidance. How we respond to that trust will determine not just the fate of this particular group, but potentially all the remaining family groups in the region. So we proceed carefully." O'Callaghan nodded. "Documented evidence kept secure, controlled disclosure to select scientific colleagues who share our commitment to protection, advocacy for expanded wilderness preservation in this region without revealing the specific reason, and we continue the dialogue they've initiated," Donnelly added. "Learn their language more thoroughly, understand their needs and boundaries, establish a foundation for limited but respectful coexistence." It was an enormous responsibility, becoming the intermediaries between 2 intelligent species with a complex and often troubled history of interaction. Yet as I looked out the window toward the dark forest beyond, I felt a sense of profound privilege alongside the weight of that responsibility. For thousands of years, these beings had watched humanity's rise from the shadows of the wilderness, adapting and surviving as our civilization expanded into their territories. Now they had chosen to reveal themselves again, to reach across the divide of separate development and attempt communication. In that moment, I understood why my grandfather had insisted I learn the old stories, why he had given me a name that meant guardian of the people. Perhaps some part of him had known that I would one day stand at this crossroads, trusted by both worlds to help forge a path forward. Outside, from the distant ridgeline came the now familiar call, That haunting, powerful vocalization that seemed to bridge the gap between animal sound and human speech. It echoed across the lake and through the ancient trees, a reminder of mysteries still unfolding in the deepest corners of the wilderness. And for the first time, I understood it not as a warning or a territorial claim, but as an invitation to a new kind of understanding between two worlds that had always existed side by side, separated only by our inability to truly see what had been there all along. The weeks following our extraordinary encounter passed in a blur of clandestine activity. O'Callagh and Donnelly extended their stay at Nimation Station, officially continuing their bioacoustic monitoring, while actually establishing the foundations for ongoing communication with the river watchers. We proceeded with extreme caution, respecting the boundaries the forest people had established. They controlled the timing and location of our meetings, always in different places, always with clear escape routes for both parties. Sometimes only the silverback would appear. Other times, he brought family members, including the juvenile who showed particular interest in our world. O'Callagh made remarkable progress with their language, a complex system combining vocalizations, hand gestures, and body postures. She determined that they called themselves something that translated roughly as the first people, considering themselves the original inhabitants of the mountain forests before humans arrived. Through these careful exchanges, we learned fragments of their history and culture. They possessed an oral tradition extending back thousands of years, passed down through generations with meticulous attention to detail. They spoke of a time when their kind was more numerous, when they had interacted more openly with certain human tribes who approached them with respect and offerings. The arrival of European settlers had changed everything. The newcomers brought weapons that killed from a distance, an insatiable hunger for resources, and no understanding of the forest's delicate balance. The first people had retreated deeper into the wilderness, a strategic withdrawal that had saved them from extinction but resulted in their gradual fade into legend among human societies. "They've been watching us the entire time," Donnelly marveled after one particularly illuminating session, observing our technological development, our wars, our environmental impacts. "They know more about us than we know about them," which explains their caution, O'Callagh added. "They've seen what happens when humans discover something valuable or unique." I found myself increasingly drawn to these encounters, not just for their scientific significance, but for the personal connection I felt to the forest people. Something about their presence resonated with the stories my grandfather had told, with the name he had given me. In their company, I felt a sense of belonging I'd never fully experienced in human society. The silverback, whom we had come to call Sentinel, based on O'Callagh's translation of his role in the group, seemed to recognize this connection. During our meetings, he often directed specific communications to me, referring to knowledge passed down through generations, to ancient agreements between our kinds that had been forgotten by most humans but preserved in the memories of the first people. It was during one such exchange, about a month after our initial contact, that Sentinel revealed the true reason they had chosen to reveal themselves now, after centuries of successful concealment. We had met in a small valley north of the lake, a natural amphitheater of stone surrounded by ancient cedars. O'Callagh translated as Sentinel communicated through an increasingly sophisticated blend of sign language and vocalizations that she had begun to understand. "The world is changing, the climate shifts. The patterns of rain and snow are not as they were. The animals move to new territories or disappear entirely. The trees sicken from heat and new diseases." This matched our scientific understanding of climate change impacts on wilderness areas, but hearing it from a being whose people had observed these forests for thousands of years gave it new weight. "The safe places grow fewer," Sentinel continued through O'Callagh's translation. "The family groups are separated by human roads, human towns. Once, we could travel from the great northern ice to the warm southern valleys. Now, isolated pockets, no exchange between groups. Weakness comes from this." "Genetic isolation," Donnelly murmured. "They're facing population fragmentation and inbreeding depression." Sentinel nodded, understanding the concept if not the specific terms. He continued his explanation. "We watch humans. Some destroy, some protect. We see how humans can change their own behavior when they understand. We decide. Careful revelation to trusted humans might help first people survive the great changes coming. They're initiating contact as a survival strategy," O'Callagh translated with growing excitement. "They recognize that without some level of human awareness and protection, their remaining habitats could be destroyed through climate change and continued development." "But why us specifically?" Donnelly asked. "Why not approach conservation organizations or government wildlife agencies directly?" Sentinel pointed at me. "Old blood, old knowledge, guardian name." Then he made a gesture I hadn't seen before, reaching out to touch my forehead lightly with his massive but surprisingly gentle hand. The contact lasted only a second, but It sent a shock of recognition through me, a visceral connection to something ancient and profound. Okulik watched with wide eyes. That's a significant gesture. From what I understand of their communication system, it indicates recognition of spiritual kinship, acknowledgement of shared ancestry or purpose. What does he mean by guardian name? Donnelly asked. Kulitika, I said quietly. My full name. It means guardian of the people in Hopi. My grandfather insisted on it, though we're only part Hopi by ancestry. Sentinel nodded emphatically and continued signing. Okulik translated. Your grandfather knew, not forgotten. Some humans remember the old agreements. A chill ran through me. Are you saying my grandfather knew about the first people? That he named me specifically because of them? The answer came with certainty. Yes, he was trusted one. Spoke with first people when young. Kept the secret. Taught you the old stories. Prepared you for this time. My mind reeled with this revelation. My grandfather had died when I was 17, taking with him the full context of the stories he had shared throughout my childhood. I had assumed his tales of forest beings were metaphorical or mythological, cultural traditions rather than literal descriptions of encounters. Yet here was Sentinel, claiming not only that my grandfather had known of their existence but had actively prepared me to serve as a bridge between our worlds. It explained his insistence on the traditional name, his emphasis on certain stories, his encouragement of my interest in forestry and wilderness management. He never told me directly, I said, more to myself than to the others. Why wouldn't he tell me they were real? Sentinel's response came with what I interpreted as gentle understanding. Secret must be earned, not given. You needed to find your own path to the first people. To see with clear eyes, not clouded by others' truth. It made a certain sense. If my grandfather had explicitly told me about the existence of these beings, I might have dismissed it as the fanciful beliefs of an old man, or worse, felt obligated to prove their existence in ways that could have endangered them. Instead, he had planted seeds of knowledge that could germinate when I was ready, when the circumstances were right. Our meeting concluded with a new sense of purpose and clarity. The first people hadn't chosen us randomly or merely because we happened to be in their territory. They had been watching, evaluating, waiting for the right combination of individuals who could help them navigate the existential challenges they faced in a rapidly changing world. As we hiked back to the station, I found myself reevaluating everything I thought I knew about my life's path, the seemingly random circumstances that had led me to Nemean Station, my inexplicable connection to this particular wilderness area, even my choice of career, all possibly influenced by my grandfather's careful preparation for this moment. You realize what this means, Okalik said as we walked. If your grandfather knew about them, there could be others. People in indigenous communities or remote areas who have maintained awareness of the first people through generations of discreet contact. A network of human allies, Donnelly added, keeping their existence secret while helping ensure their territories remain protected. It would explain some of the consistent patterns in folklore across different cultures, Okalik continued. Not just similar descriptions of the beings themselves, but similar taboos about entering certain areas, similar offerings left at boundary markers. The implications were staggering. Not just for our understanding of these specific beings, but for human history itself. How much of our development had occurred under the watchful eyes of another intelligent species? How had their presence influenced our myths, our spiritual practices, our concept of wilderness? Back at the station, I dug through my personal belongings until I found a small wooden box I had inherited from my grandfather. Inside were various keepsakes, eagle feathers, interesting stones, a few old photographs. At the bottom, wrapped in soft leather, was an object I had always assumed was merely decorative, a small carving of a tall, broad-shouldered figure with distinct non-human features. I had thought it represented a kachina or some other traditional spirit figure. Now, looking at it with new understanding, I recognized it as a remarkably accurate depiction of a being like Sentinel. My grandfather had left me a physical reminder of the truth behind his stories, waiting for the day when I would recognize what it truly represented. That night, I sat alone by the lake, watching moonlight ripple across the water while turning the carving over in my hands. From the surrounding forest came occasional sounds of nocturnal wildlife, the hoot of an owl, the distant howl of a wolf pack, the rustle of deer moving through underbrush. And then, from much farther away, on the ridgeline beyond Echo Valley, came the distinctive call of the first people, a powerful vocalization that carried for miles through the clear mountain air. It was answered by another call from a different direction, then another, the sounds overlapping in what I now recognized as a complex communication system rather than random animal noises. They were out there, moving through their ancient territories, discussing the day's events, perhaps even discussing us and the unprecedented relationship we were beginning to forge. I wondered how many generations of my ancestors had heard these same calls and recognized them for what they were, keeping the knowledge alive through stories and teachings while the wider world dismissed such accounts as superstition or folklore. The responsibility I felt was enormous. The first people had chosen to trust us with their existence at a critical moment in their history. How we responded would determine not just their fate, but potentially our understanding of what it means to share this planet with another intelligent species that has observed our development from the shadows of the wilderness. As dawn approached, I reached a decision. The path forward would require careful navigation between scientific documentation and ethical protection, between controlled revelation and necessary secrecy. But I was no longer uncertain about my role in this unfolding story. My name was Kaleidoka, guardian of the people. And now I understood which people my grandfather had intended me to guard. The morning brought a somber development. Peterson arrived unannounced, his expression grave as he requested a private conversation away from the researchers. "There's a situation developing that you need to be aware of," he said once we were alone on the lakeshore. "The university research permit has attracted attention from some concerning parties." "What kind of attention?" I asked, though I already sensed where this was heading. "A private company called Vertex Explorations has submitted a FOIA request for all documentation related to the current research project at Nemetian Station. They're specifically interested in the unusual wildlife observations mentioned in your initial reports." My stomach tightened. What's their interest in wildlife research? Officially, they're a resource development consulting firm. Unofficially, they have connections to trophy hunting operations and exotic animal trafficking. They've been implicated in several investigations involving endangered species, though nothing's ever stuck. Peterson sighed. The concerning part is their political connections. They have enough influence to push for expanded access to wilderness areas currently under protection. The threat was clear. Somehow, word of our discoveries had leaked, perhaps through university channels, perhaps through the sheriff's department that had responded to our missing researcher incident. Now, an organization with the worst possible motives was positioning itself to exploit that information. "What's the timeline on this?" I asked. "The FOIA request is being processed. Legal says we'll have to provide the basic documentation within 2 weeks. That includes your field reports, patrol logs, and any official communications about the research project." I nodded slowly, mind racing through implications. "I understand. Thank you for the heads up." "Rivers," Peterson said carefully. "I don't know exactly what you found up here, but I've worked in these forests for 30 years, and I've heard the stories. If there's something in these mountains that needs protection from people like Vertex, now's the time to ensure that protection is in place." His meaning was clear. Whatever my personal beliefs about the first people, Peterson was offering tacit support for measures that would preserve the wilderness from exploitation. After he departed, I called an emergency meeting with O'Callagh and Donnelly. Their reaction to the news was as grave as I expected. "This is precisely the scenario we feared," O'Callagh said. "Commercial interests getting wind of something unusual before proper scientific documentation and protection can be established." "How much do they know?" Donnelly asked. "Your reports didn't specifically mention Sasquatch or hominids, did they?" "No, just unusual wildlife activity and unidentified large mammals. But combined with the university research permit and the emergency response incident, it's enough to attract attention from people looking for the next exotic trophy." "We need to accelerate our documentation and protection strategy," O'Callagh decided. "I have contacts at the Interior Department and in several conservation organizations. With the right approach, we could secure emergency habitat protection based on endangered species considerations without immediately specifying which species. And I can work through academic channels to establish peer review protocols for our findings," Donnelly added. "Create a framework for controlled scientific assessment that prioritizes subject safety over publicity." Their professionalism was reassuring, but I knew we faced a race against time. Vertex and similar interests had resources and political connections that could override scientific concerns if sufficient economic incentives were involved. "There's something else we need to do," I said. "We need to warn the first people about this development. They trusted us with their existence. We owe them transparency about the potential threats now emerging." We arranged a meeting that very afternoon, using the communication method Sentinel had taught us, a distinctive bird call repeated in a specific pattern that carried through the forest without arousing suspicion from casual listeners. The response came quickly. Sentinel and 2 others I hadn't seen before, older members of the group, based on the silver coloring of their hair, met us in a small clearing about a mile from the station. Through O'Callagh's translation, I explained the situation. Unknown parties with potential harmful intent had become aware of unusual activity in the area. and were seeking information and access. Sentinel's reaction displayed a sophisticated understanding of human politics and motivations. He asked detailed questions about Vertex's capabilities, their connections to government authorities, and the timeline for potential intrusion into First People territory. The older members of the group communicated among themselves in their own language, a rapid exchange of vocalizations and gestures that Okalik couldn't fully translate. Their manner suggested concern but not panic, a measured assessment of threat from beings who had survived centuries of human expansion through careful adaptation and strategic withdrawal. Finally, Sentinel shared their decision. The First People would temporarily relocate deeper into the wilderness, away from areas with established human trails or monitoring equipment. They would remove or conceal signs of their presence near Echo Valley and the cave system we had visited. Most importantly, they would alert other family groups in the region about the potential threat, activating what appeared to be a long-established warning network that spanned territories far beyond Namishan. "They've done this before," Okalek observed as she translated their plans. "This is a practiced response to human intrusion, strategic withdrawal, and information sharing across multiple groups. Ask them how we can help," I said. "What can we do to minimize the danger?" Sentinel's answer was pragmatic. "Continue our scientific documentation, but secure it thoroughly. Control access to the station and surrounding areas as much as our authority permitted, and most importantly, maintain regular communication with the First People through the channels they had established." As the meeting concluded, Sentinel made a gesture I now recognized as their form of a formal agreement or pact. He placed one massive hand over his heart, then extended it toward us with fingers spread, an offering of trust combined with a request for protection. All three of us returned the gesture instinctively. In that moment, the weight of responsibility settled fully on my shoulders. This wasn't merely an exciting scientific discovery or a personal connection to my grandfather's legacy. It was a solemn commitment to protecting an entire people whose continued existence now depended partly on our actions. The next 2 weeks unfolded in a carefully orchestrated balance of official compliance and strategic omission. I submitted the required reports for the FOIA request, documenting only what was already in official records: unidentified wildlife activity, unusual vocalizations, researchers' interest in ecosystem health monitoring, nothing that explicitly identified the presence of an undocumented hominid species. Meanwhile, Okalik and Donnelly worked tirelessly through their professional networks to lay groundwork for both scientific verification and habitat protection. They arranged for a small, carefully selected team of trusted colleagues to review their preliminary findings under strict confidentiality agreements. They initiated discussions with conservation organizations about expanded wilderness protections based on sensitive ecosystem components, requiring special consideration. Throughout this period, we maintained regular contact with Sentinel and his group, updating them on developments and receiving reports of their own observations. They confirmed that other family groups had received the warning and were implementing similar concealment strategies. They also reported increased human activity along the wilderness boundaries, individuals with surveying equipment and drones that didn't match standard Forest Service or research operations. Vertex was already conducting preliminary assessments, presumably in preparation for a more formal expedition once they obtained the information they sought. The situation came to a head 18 days after Peterson's warning. I returned from a boundary patrol to find an unfamiliar vehicle parked at the station, a black SUV with tinted windows and corporate plates. Standing on my porch, engaged in conversation with Okalik and Donnelly, was a man whose expensive outdoor clothing and manicured appearance marked him as an executive rather than a field researcher. "Ah, Ranger Rivers," he called as I approached, his smile not reaching his eyes. "Just the man I was hoping to see. Victor Mercer, Executive Director of Special Projects at Vertex Explorations." His handshake was firm but slightly damp, his manner aggressively confident. "Your colleagues have been telling me about their fascinating research. Bioacoustic monitoring, environmental health indicators, all valuable data for sustainable resource management." I maintained a neutral expression. "We value all scientific contributions to understanding these ecosystems, Mr. Mercer. What brings Vertex to Namishan?" "Direct, I appreciate that." His smile widened. "We're conducting preliminary assessments for potential resource development opportunities in the region. The university research caught our attention, particularly some unusual findings mentioned in your reports, all documented in the materials provided through the FOIA request," I replied evenly. "Yes, those were helpful, if somewhat limited." A brief flash of annoyance crossed his features. "I was hoping you might elaborate on the unidentified large mammals mentioned several times. Anything unusual about their behavior or characteristics?" Okalik interjected before I could respond. Our formal findings will be published through peer-reviewed scientific journals, Mr. Mercer. Preliminary observations aren't suitable for public dissemination. Mercer's attention shifted to her, his expression calculating. Dr. Okalik, your background isn't actually in bioacoustics, is it? Your previous publications focus on primate evolution and isolated populations of great apes. Quite a shift to forest ecosystem monitoring. The implied threat was clear. He knew more about the true nature of their research than we had hoped. Donnelly stepped forward, his Australian accent thickening slightly as it did when he was stressed. Research scientists often apply methodologies across disciplines, mate. Evolutionary biology and ecosystem health share many analytic approaches. Perhaps you could tell us Vertex's specific interest in our work? Transparency works both ways. Mercer's facade of collegial interest hardened slightly. Very well. Vertex has received credible reports of an undocumented large mammal species in this region, one with potential scientific and commercial significance. We're prepared to invest considerable resources in documenting and, perhaps, preserving specimens. The euphemism wasn't lost on any of us. Preserving specimens meant killing and collecting, exactly the outcome the first people had feared from human discovery. Fascinating, I replied with deliberate blandness. The Forest Service welcomes scientific interest in our wilderness areas, provided all activities comply with federal protection regulations. Any expedition would require detailed permits, environmental impact assessments, and approval from multiple agencies. I'd be happy to provide you with the appropriate application forms. Mercer's smile became a tight line. Yes, the famous bureaucratic gauntlet. Fortunately, Vertex has excellent relationships with regulatory agencies at the highest levels. We anticipate expedited processing of our requests. He pulled a business card from his jacket and handed it to me. I'll be in the area for several days, conducting preliminary surveys with my team. We have permits for drone operations and ground-level data collection. I hope we can count on your cooperation, Ranger Rivers. Within the scope of my authority, certainly, I replied carefully. After Mercer departed, we gathered in my cabin to assess this alarming development. He knows something specific, Donnelly said. That comment about primate evolution wasn't coincidental. Someone's talked, or they've obtained information through less official channels, Okalik suggested. Corporate espionage, hacking, bribes to someone in the approval chain for our research permits. Regardless of how they know, the threat is immediate, I said. We need to warn Sentinel immediately, and we need to accelerate our protection strategy. Okalik nodded grimly. I've been working on something that might help. A colleague at Interior has proposed an emergency designation of this region as a critical habitat study area. It would temporarily restrict all commercial activities and non-essential access, while a comprehensive biological assessment is conducted. How quickly could that happen? I asked. With the right pressure, days rather than weeks. I have calls scheduled with 3 senior officials tomorrow morning, and I've prepared a preliminary scientific brief, Donnelly added, carefully worded to establish the potential significance of our findings without explicitly identifying the species involved. Enough to justify aggressive protection measures among the scientific community. I considered our options. We need to buy time. Mercer mentioned drone operations. Those could cover vast areas of wilderness quickly, potentially locating signs of the first people before they can fully implement their concealment strategies. Can you restrict the drone permits? Donnelly asked. Find some regulatory reason to delay them? I shook my head. Not without solid justification that would withstand legal challenge, but a thought occurred to me. The weather forecast calls for thunderstorms in the mountains over the next 3 days. Safety regulations prohibit drone operations during electrical storm conditions or high winds, and if the weather stations happen to report higher wind speeds or storm probability than actually occurred, Okalik suggested, understanding my implication. Technical glitches happen in remote monitoring equipment, I agreed, especially during storm systems. It wasn't a long-term solution, but it might provide the critical days needed for Okalik's emergency designation to take effect. Sometimes, protecting the greater good required bending rules that would allow destruction if followed blindly. That evening, we traveled to the meeting point Sentinel had established for urgent communications. The Silverback arrived quickly, accompanied by a different group member, one with distinctive scarring across his chest that suggested a past encounter with human weapons. Through Okalik's translation, we explained the immediate threat. Vertex had specific knowledge about a potential undiscovered species, and were deploying drones and ground teams for extensive surveys. They had political connections that might override normal protective measures, and their interest was clearly in specimens rather than protection. Sentinel received this information with grim acknowledgement rather than surprise. The scarred individual, whom Okalike identified by a name that translated roughly as battle scar, displayed more agitation, making emphatic gestures and vocalizations that suggested a preference for aggressive response rather than continued retreat. An intense discussion ensued between the two forest people, with Battle Scar arguing forcefully for what Okalik hesitantly translated as reminding humans why they fear the deep woods, while Sentinel advocated for continued strategic avoidance and alliance with supportive humans like ourselves. Eventually, Sentinel's position prevailed, though Battlescar's final gesture, a slashing motion across his throat, required no translation. If human intrusion reached a critical threshold, more direct measures would be considered. Their decision was multi-layered: immediate relocation of vulnerable group members, young, elderly, injured, to the most remote territories, deployment of scouts to track human movements, continuation of the Ghost Protocol, a systematic elimination of visible evidence of their presence, and maintained communication with our team for coordination purposes. As the meeting concluded, Battlescar approached me directly. Unlike Sentinel's generally gentle demeanor, this individual radiated controlled aggression. He pointed at me, then at himself, then made a gesture that Okalik translated with visible discomfort. "If your kind betrays us, he will personally ensure you understand the consequences." I met his gaze steadily. "I understand, but know this: not all humans are the same, just as I recognize not all of your people share the same views. I will do everything in my power to protect your territory and your people." Battlescar held my gaze for several long moments before giving a curt nod and melting into the forest with surprising speed for such a large being. Sentinel remained briefly, communicating a final message that resonated with unexpected depth. "Your grandfather faced this choice also. He chose wisely. Now the choice comes to you." With that cryptic statement, he too disappeared into the gathering darkness, leaving us to contemplate the escalating stakes of our involvement. The next 3 days unfolded in a careful dance of obstruction and preparation. As planned, the weather monitoring stations in the region began reporting anomalous wind conditions and increased storm probabilities, effectively grounding Vertex drone operations. Meanwhile, Peterson, who had become a quiet ally without ever explicitly acknowledging the true nature of what we were protecting, implemented a series of routine trail closures and ranger patrols that effectively limited ground access to key areas. Okalik and Donnelly worked tirelessly through their professional networks, building support for the emergency habitat designation, while preparing scientific documentation that would withstand scrutiny without revealing more than necessary about the first people. Mercer grew increasingly frustrated with the delays, his initially polished corporate manner giving way to barely concealed threats about regulatory consequences and career implications. I maintained a rigidly professional approach, citing Forest Service protocols and safety regulations with meticulous attention to detail that gave him no actionable grounds for complaint. On the 4th day, a breakthrough. Okalik received confirmation that the Interior Department had approved the Emergency Critical Habitat designation, effective immediately and lasting for an initial period of 120 days. All commercial permits for the region were temporarily suspended pending comprehensive biological assessment. I had the distinct pleasure of delivering this news to Mercer personally, presenting him with the official notification while maintaining a carefully neutral expression. "This is absurd," he fumed, scanning the document. "We'll have this overturned within days. Do you have any idea the level of political influence Vertex commands?" "I'm sure your legal team will pursue all available options," I replied evenly. "In the meantime, all non-essential access to the designated areas is suspended. Your team will need to vacate the research perimeter by tomorrow at 0800. His face flushed with anger. "This isn't over, Rivers. Whatever you and your scientist friends think you're protecting, Vertex will find it. And when we do, there will be consequences for this obstruction. Just following federal regulations, Mr. Mercer. I'm sure a company with Vertex reputation fully supports proper environmental protections." After he stormed off, Okalik approached from where she had been observing the exchange. "That buys us time, but not security," she said quietly. "He's right about their influence. They'll work every angle to get this designation reversed. Then we use the time wisely," I replied. "How soon can your scientific assessment team be on site?" 3 days. I've selected researchers with the highest ethical standards and previous experience with sensitive species. They understand the protocols, documentation without disturbance, classified findings until protection frameworks are established. It was a carefully balanced approach, gathering the scientific evidence needed to justify permanent protection, while minimizing the risk to the first people during the process. Not ideal, but necessary given the realities of our legal system. which required documented evidence of what we were protecting. That evening, as Vertex reluctantly packed their equipment for mandatory departure, I traveled alone to the communication point to update Sentinel on these developments. The temporary victory, the continuing threats, the carefully controlled scientific assessment to come. I found not Sentinel waiting for me, but an older female I hadn't met before. Her silver-gray hair and deeply lined face suggested considerable age, yet she moved with surprising grace as she emerged from the shadows. Around her neck hung a pendant carved from polished stone, a symbol similar to the one on the carving my grandfather had left me. Through the limited sign language I had learned, supplemented by gestures and drawings in the dirt, she communicated her identity. She was the group's keeper of memories, responsible for maintaining the oral history and traditions of the first people through generations. She had known my grandfather during his youth, when he had encountered their kind while working as a seasonal forest guide. This revelation stunned me. Direct confirmation that my grandfather had indeed interacted with these beings, had been trusted with their secret, had carried that knowledge through his life while preparing me in subtle ways to eventually discover the same truth. The memory keeper shared something else. My grandfather had faced a similar situation decades earlier, when resource development interests had threatened First People territory. He had helped conceal their presence, had misdirected those seeking evidence, had chosen to protect rather than exploit his knowledge. Now, she indicated, the cycle had returned. Different humans, same threat. Different guardian, same choice. As our communication concluded, she performed a ceremony I didn't fully understand but instinctively recognized as significant, marking my forehead with red ochre from a small pouch she carried, then placing her hands on my shoulders while making a series of vocalizations that seemed directed not at me, but at something unseen around us. When she finished, she pointed to the mountains, then to my heart, then made the sign for unity or connection, linking her fingers together in a powerful gesture that needed no translation. I was being formally acknowledged as a guardian of the First People, a role my grandfather had apparently held before me. Not a scientific observer or temporary ally, but someone bound to their welfare through generations of trust and shared purpose. The responsibility was immense, but I accepted it without hesitation. As the memory keeper disappeared into the forest, I felt a profound sense of clarity about the path forward, not just for the immediate crisis with Vertex, but for my life's work. The next 2 weeks unfolded in a carefully orchestrated ballet of scientific documentation, legal maneuvering, and continued protection of the First People's privacy. Okalik's assessment team arrived as scheduled, conducting their work with exceptional sensitivity to the ethical complexities involved. They gathered evidence of an undocumented hominid species, footprints, hair samples, vocalizations, even distant thermal imagery, while respecting the boundaries Sentinel had established. Vertex, as expected, mounted an aggressive legal and political campaign to overturn the emergency designation. They submitted formal complaints, leveraged political connections, even attempted to discredit Okalik and Donnelly's scientific credentials through background investigations and selective media leaks. But we had prepared well. The preliminary scientific evidence was compelling enough to withstand scrutiny. Conservation organizations rallied behind the habitat protection, recognizing its importance even without full disclosure of the specific species involved. Indigenous rights groups, subtly informed about the cultural significance of the area without explicit mention of the First People, added their considerable moral authority to the protection efforts. Most surprisingly, Peterson and several other veteran Forest Service personnel stepped forward with their own accounts of unexplained encounters over decades of wilderness management, not direct confirmation of the First People, but enough corroborating evidence of something unusual to justify continued protection measures. By the end of the 3rd month, it became clear that the emergency designation would be extended and likely converted to permanent protected status. Vertex gradually reduced their active opposition, though Mercer made it clear in a final confrontational visit that they were merely redirecting their efforts rather than abandoning them. "There are other areas, other reports," he said as he prepared to depart. "Whatever you're hiding here, it can't be unique to just this location. We'll find evidence elsewhere, without your interference." His words were unsettling precisely because they contained truth. The First People weren't limited to Nemetian's territory. Their family groups extended throughout the mountain ranges of the Pacific Northwest, each facing similar pressures from human expansion and resource development. As Okalik and Donnelly's official research period concluded, we faced the question of what came next. They had accumulated enough evidence to justify continued protection without revealing the full nature of what we had discovered. Their carefully worded research papers described compelling evidence of an undocumented large mammal species of significant scientific interest, while emphasizing the ethical imperative of habitat protection over specimen collection. I've been offered a position with the Conservation Biology Institute, Okalik told me as we walked along the lakeshore on what would be one of her final days at the station, leading a new program focused specifically on ethically studying potentially sensitive undocumented species. Created with this situation in mind? I asked. She nodded. The institute director knows enough to understand the significance without demanding full disclosure. It would give me resources to continue this work, not just here, but potentially in other areas where similar beings might exist. And you, Donnelly? The Australian grinned. I'm joining her team, of course. Someone needs to keep her from getting too caught up in the science to remember the people behind it. Their departure would change the nature of our work with the first people, but not end it. We had established communications, built trust, created a foundation for ongoing interactions that could potentially expand over time to include other trusted humans. On their final evening at Nemean, we held a small ceremony at the lakeshore. Sentinel and several members of his group emerged from the forest at dusk, their massive forms silhouetted against the setting sun. They brought gifts, intricately woven baskets containing forest medicines, stone tools of exquisite craftsmanship, and most precious of all, detailed maps drawn on bark showing territories, seasonal movement patterns, and potential danger areas where different groups might react with hostility to human contact. These were not merely symbolic offerings, but practical tools for continuing our work of protection and understanding. Through Okalik's now fluent translation, Sentinel explained that their Council of Elders had decided to formalize the relationship we had begun, not just with our specific individuals, but with the concept of respectful human connection after generations of deliberate separation. The world changes, he signed. The old ways of complete hiding no longer protect us. Some humans must know, must help, must speak for the first people when decisions are made about the lands we share. It was a profound philosophical shift, a strategic adaptation to changing environmental and political realities. Just as humans needed to adjust our understanding of what and who existed in the wilderness, the first people had recognized the necessity of limited but meaningful engagement with human society after centuries of avoidance. As the ceremony concluded, Sentinel approached me directly, placing one massive hand on my shoulder in a gesture of trust and connection. Your grandfather would be proud, he signed. The circle continues, the guardian watches, the forest remembers. In that moment, standing between worlds, I understood more clearly than ever the responsibility I had inherited, not just to protect a physical territory or even a recently discovered species, but to preserve the possibility of connection between two intelligent peoples who had shared this continent for thousands of years without truly knowing one another. The sun sank below the mountains, casting long shadows across Lake Nemean. From the distant ridgelines came the haunting calls of the first people, echoing between peaks as they had for countless generations before humans named these landscapes or claimed them as their own. I listened with new understanding, recognizing patterns and meanings in what had once seemed merely mysterious. They were not calls of defiance or territorial warnings, but something far more profound. Reminders of ancient knowledge, affirmations of continued existence, invitations to remember that the human story was only one thread in the complex tapestry of consciousness that inhabited these mountains. As darkness fell and stars appeared above the lake, I silently renewed the promise I had made to Sentinel, to the Memory Keeper, to my grandfather's legacy, and to the wilderness itself. The first people had survived for millennia by adapting to changing conditions while maintaining their essential nature. Now they faced perhaps their greatest challenge in learning to coexist with an expanding human presence that both threatened and potentially offered protection. In this uncertain future, they would need guardians who understood both worlds, humans who recognized the profound value of preserving not just biological diversity, but the unique consciousness and culture of these ancient beings. My name was Koletica, guardian of the people, and I had found my purpose at last. I never intended to work as a park ranger in the remotest parts of Alaska's wilderness. Life had other plans. My name is Dakota Rivers, which means friend to everyone in Sioux. My grandfather was full Sioux, my grandmother Inuit. They taught me to respect the land, to read its signs, and to understand that some places remain untamed for a reason. Before accepting the position at Blackwater Lake Outpost, I had built a respectable career in environmental science. But after my wife's death in a car accident 3 years ago, urban life became unbearable. Every street corner, every restaurant, every familiar face carried memories that cut like glass. When the National Park Service posted the opening for a senior wilderness ranger at one of their most isolated outposts, I applied without hesitation. You understand this assignment is different, Ranger Supervisor Anderson said during my interview. With his weathered face and calculating eyes, He looked like he'd seen things he wished he hadn't. Blackwater Lake is 90 miles from the nearest town. Winter isolation lasts 7 months. Summer brings tourists, but they're few and supervised from a distance. Your job is to monitor wildlife, maintain trails, and ensure no one ventures into restricted areas. Why are areas restricted? I asked. Anderson shifted in his seat. Environmental concerns. Fragile ecosystems. I sensed he wasn't telling me everything, but I didn't care. Isolation was exactly what I wanted. There's something else you should know, Anderson added, studying my reaction. Locals have stories about the region, native legends, the usual wilderness folklore. Nothing substantiated, but it keeps most people from wanting the post. I don't believe in ghost stories, I replied. Good, Anderson nodded, sliding the assignment papers toward me. Because whatever you hear, whatever you think you see out there, it has a rational explanation. 2 weeks later, a bush plane dropped me at Blackwater Lake. The pilot, a gruff man named Hank, seemed eager to leave. Radio check-ins twice daily, he reminded me as he unloaded my supplies. Missed 2 consecutive calls, and they send someone. But winter's coming, so bad weather might delay rescue operations by days, maybe weeks. I surveyed my new home, a sturdy 2-room cabin of dark timber with a metal roof, solar panels, and a small generator shed. Behind it rose dense forest that stretched to snow-capped mountains. Before it lay Blackwater Lake, so named for its unusual depth and dark waters that absorbed light rather than reflected it. Beautiful, I murmured. That's one word for it, Hank replied, already climbing back into his plane. First ranger lasted 6 months before requesting transfer. Second one, 3 months. Third one. He paused. Well, they found his boat drifting empty. What happened to him? I asked. Official report says he went fishing without a life vest. Fell overboard. Drowned. Hank's expression darkened, but his gear was still in the boat, including his lunch, half-eaten. The plane's engine roared to life. Make your radio check-ins, Hank shouted over the noise, and stay out of the North Woods after dark. As I watched the plane become a speck against the vast Alaskan sky, an unfamiliar sensation settled over me. Not fear, but awareness. The silence was absolute except for wind through pines and water lapping at shore. I spent that first day organizing supplies and familiarizing myself with equipment. The cabin was well stocked. Emergency medical supplies, maps, firearm, flares, satellite phone for emergencies, and standard issue radio. The logbook contained entries from previous rangers, detailed at first, becoming increasingly terse, with the last entry simply reading, "Something watches from the trees." That night, I made my first radio check-in. Blackwater Outpost to dispatch. Over. Static then. Dispatch receiving. How's the first day, Dakota? Quiet. Peaceful. Glad to hear it. Weather report shows clear skies for the next 3 days. Good time to familiarize yourself with the trails. Over. Will do. Blackwater out. I stepped onto the porch, breathing in pine-scented air. Stars blazed overhead, uncountable and brilliant without light pollution. This was why I came. This stillness, this removal from human chaos. A sound broke the silence, wood cracking, like a massive weight stepping on a fallen branch. It came from the North Woods, precisely where Hank had warned me not to go after dark. I shone my flashlight toward the tree line. Nothing moved, but I felt watched. Not by animal eyes. Animals don't hide their observation. This felt deliberate, calculating. The radio crackled inside, making me jump. Dispatch to Blackwater. Forgot to mention, avoid investigating unusual sounds at night. Protocol is to document and report only. Understood? How had they known? The cabin lacked external surveillance. Understood, I replied. Any particular reason? Bears, wolves, occasional moose. No point risking confrontation in darkness. Dispatch out. I locked the cabin door that night, something I hadn't planned to do in such isolation. As I drifted toward sleep, I heard it again. Heavy footsteps circling the cabin, pausing occasionally as if listening. Too deliberate for an animal, too heavy for a human. In the morning, I found tracks in the soft earth around the cabin, 18 inches long, humanoid but wider, with what appeared to be 5 toes. The imprints sank 3 inches into hard-packed soil, suggesting immense weight. I photographed them before the morning sun erased the dew that made them visible. According to my training manual, I should report unusual wildlife signs immediately, but something made me hesitate. These weren't bear tracks or wolf prints. They resembled no known animal in the region. Instead, I wrote in my logbook, unidentified large mammal circled cabin during night. Bipedal gait, estimated weight exceeding 500 pounds based on impression depth. That day, I hiked the southern trails, mapping creek crossings and noting locations needing maintenance. The work felt good, purposeful and absorbing. Yet throughout the day, I couldn't shake the feeling of being observed from just beyond visual range. When I returned to the cabin that evening, something had changed. The door remained locked, the windows intact, but someone, or something, had been inside. My supplies were untouched, but the visitor had left their mark, a crude symbol drawn in mud on the inside wall above my bunk, resembling a tall, broad-shouldered figure with elongated arms. I photographed this too, then scrubbed it away. During my evening check-in, I reported only routine observations. Something warned me against mentioning the tracks or symbol. Not fear of ridicule, but instinct. The same instinct that tells prey when displaying weakness invites attack. That night, the footsteps returned. Closer, bolder. Between their heavy tread, I heard breathing outside my window. Deep, rhythmic rushes of air from massive lungs. I lay motionless, eyes fixed on darkness, hand on the hunting knife beside my pillow. Whatever circled my cabin was testing boundaries, learning my reactions. I decided to give it nothing to learn. Dawn revealed new tracks, and a massive handprint pressed against my bedroom window, visible in the condensation. 5 fingers, but proportionally wrong for a human hand, with a palm nearly 12 inches across. Something intelligent was stalking Blackwater Lake. Something that walked upright and could draw symbols. Something large enough to kill me with minimal effort. I was exactly where I needed to be. The radio call came just after my morning check-in. 3 hikers reported missing along the Northern Ridge Trail. They had registered their hiking plan at the ranger station in town 5 days ago, with an expected return 3 days ago. Their vehicle remained at the trailhead parking area. Search and rescue team is 12 hours out, dispatch informed me. You're to begin preliminary search and assessment. Copy that, I replied, gathering emergency gear. I'll start from their entry point and follow the registered route. Negative Ranger Rivers. Weather satellite shows storm front moving in from the north. Start from Blackwater and work toward their last known position. We don't need another missing ranger. I studied my maps before setting out. The Northern Ridge Trail crossed 3 watersheds before circling back to the main road. A challenging but manageable 3-day trek for experienced hikers. All 3 missing persons were described as intermediate-level outdoorsmen. Jackson Lawrence, age 32, Matthew White, age 36, and Bradley Quinn, age 29. The trail began half a mile from my cabin, winding through dense forest before climbing toward alpine meadows. I moved quickly but methodically, scanning for broken branches, discarded items, or signs of deviation from the path. 2 miles in, I found the first evidence. A candy wrapper caught on a bush, dated packaging suggesting recent discard. I photographed it, logged the GPS coordinates, and continued. The forest changed character as I progressed northward. Trees grew more gnarled, their branches twisting at unnatural angles. Moss hung in thick curtains, dampening sound. Even the bird calls seemed muted, distorted. 4 miles from Blackwater, I found their first campsite. The tent had been properly erected but was now collapsed, with signs of hasty departure, sleeping bags still inside, cooking equipment scattered. More concerning, their bare canister containing food had been torn open, not by claws but as if crushed by enormous hands. The reinforced plastic had splintered under pressure no bear could exert. I collected a fragment for analysis and documented the scene. Their hiking log, standard practice for groups in remote areas, lay open beside the fire pit. The last entry read, Day 2. Made good progress despite rain. Matt thinks he saw someone watching from the trees this morning. Tall figure, but probably just a moose. Strange sounds all night, like wood knocking. Jackson wants to push ahead to Crater Lake tomorrow, rather than following original route. Says he wants to check something out. I radioed the information to dispatch, reporting the change in their planned route. Crater Lake lay 2 miles north, deeper into the restricted territory. Be advised, Ranger Rivers. Satellite shows weather deteriorating faster than predicted. Complete your assessment of this site and return to Blackwater. There are 3 missing hikers, I countered. I should at least check Crater Lake before dark. Static then. Proceed with extreme caution. Maintain radio contact every 30 minutes. As I approached Crater Lake, the forest fell preternaturally silent. No insects buzzing, no birds calling, no wind rustling leaves. Just profound stillness that made my footsteps sound obscenely loud. The lake itself was small, nestled in what appeared to be an ancient impact crater. Its waters were black and still, reflecting the gray sky like a mirror. At its edge stood the hiker's second tent, intact but empty. I approached cautiously, calling out, "Forest Service, anyone here?" My voice echoed across the water and died. No response. Inside the tent, I found evidence of normal camping activity suddenly abandoned. Half-played card game, open books, jackets still hanging on the center pole. Outside, their cooking fire had burned to cold ash, suggesting at least 12 hours since departure. What caught my attention was a camera, a high-end DSLR lying on a sleeping bag. I turned it on, cycling through recent images. Standard hiking photos, landscape shots, group selfies of 3 smiling men. Then the images changed character. A series of blurred photos taken in rapid succession at night, illuminated by flash. Something massive moving among trees. A partial glimpse of matted hair, a muscular limb. Then clearer, an enormous figure at the forest's edge, captured from behind, at least 8 feet tall, broad-shouldered, covered in dark brown hair. The final image turned my insides cold. The same figure, now facing the camera from about 50 feet away. Though the details were indistinct, I could make out deep-set eyes beneath a heavy brow ridge, a wide, flat nose, and what might have been an expression of rage. I saved the images to my phone before continuing my search. Beyond the campsite, I found footprints. The hikers' boots, showing they had fled into the woods, rather than following the trail back. Among their tracks were the same massive, humanoid prints I'd found around my cabin. Only these showed signs of pursuit, deeper at the toe, indicating running. I followed the chaotic trail of broken branches and disturbed ground until it led to a clearing where signs of struggle were evident. Torn fabric, a broken trekking pole, blood on leaves. The hikers' tracks ended here, replaced by drag marks leading deeper into the forest. The drag marks led to what I first mistook for a natural cave entrance, half hidden by vegetation. Closer inspection revealed crude tool marks around the opening. This was a den, one that had been used for generations judging by the wear patterns. I switched on my flashlight, drew my service pistol, and stepped inside, every instinct screaming against this decision. The passage descended sharply, opening into a larger chamber where daylight filtered through cracks in the ceiling. The smell hit me first. Raw meat, urine, musk so powerful it made my eyes water. Then I saw them, bones scattered across the floor. Most were animal remains, deer, elk, bear, but among them lay unmistakably human fragments. Some were ancient, others disturbingly fresh. Against the far wall were items clearly taken from hikers over years. Backpacks, clothing, watches, cameras, all arranged in bizarre collections. Similar items grouped together as if by a mind trying to understand their purpose. My radio crackled, startling me. Ranger Rivers, check-in overdue. Report status. Before I could respond, a sound reverberated through the cave. A deep guttural vocalization from somewhere deeper in the tunnel system. Not animal, not human, but somewhere horrifyingly between. I backed toward the entrance, radioing quietly. Found possible evidence of hikers. Requesting immediate assistance at Crater Lake. There's something. The transmission cut off as a massive silhouette blocked the cave entrance. Backlit by fading daylight stood a figure straight from primeval nightmares. Over 8 feet tall, barrel-chested, with arms hanging below its knees. Though standing upright, it knuckle-walked forward several steps, revealing a face that paralyzed me with its impossible existence. Primitive yet unnervingly intelligent eyes, set in a sloped forehead. Observing me with unmistakable calculation, I raised my weapon instinctively. The creature's response was immediate. It slammed both fists against its chest, producing a thunderous sound that reverberated through the cave. Then it charged. I fired twice, the muzzle flash illuminating matted fur as bullets struck its torso. The creature howled, pain, rage, surprise, before retreating back through the entrance. I seized the moment, running for daylight, emerging to find twilight descending and no sign of my attacker. I sprinted back toward the lake, toward the trail, toward Blackwater, my radio transmitting continuously. Ranger under attack, unknown assailant at Crater Lake Cave System. Static answered me until I reached higher ground, where dispatch finally responded. Search and rescue diverted due to severe weather. Return to Blackwater immediately. Repeat, do not pursue missing hikers. Night fell before I reached the halfway point. Rain began pelting through the canopy as thunder rolled across mountains. I activated my emergency location beacon and continued down the trail, my flashlight beam bouncing wildly across the path. Behind me came sounds of pursuit, breaking branches, heavy breathing, occasional vocalizations like no known animal. Sometimes it seemed to parallel my course, moving through trees alongside the trail. Other times it fell behind, only to surge closer with terrifying speed. I reached Blackwater near midnight, soaked and exhausted. Locking myself inside, I immediately barricaded the door and windows with furniture. Through sheets of rain, I could see movement at the forest edge, massive shapes, more than one, watching from just beyond clear visibility. My radio call to dispatch was met with disturbing indifference. Document your findings, Ranger Rivers. Search and rescue will assess when weather permits. There's something out there, I insisted. Something intelligent, predatory. It's taken those hikers, probably others before them. Your concerns are noted, came the reply. Too measured, too calm. Maintain position at Blackwater. Assistance will arrive when possible. That night, they tested my defenses, pressing against windows, rattling the door, climbing onto the metal roof where their weight created alarming creaks in the structure. I sat against the wall beneath my rifle rack, service pistol in hand, listening to them try to find a way inside. Toward dawn, one approached my bedroom window. Rather than attempting entry, it pressed something against the glass. A human hand, severed at the wrist, still wearing a watch that matched the description of what Jackson Lawrence had been wearing when he disappeared. The creatures were sending a message. They could reach me whenever they chose. Dawn brought eerie silence. The rain had stopped, leaving the forest draped in mist. No birds sang. I checked each window cautiously before removing the barricades. Outside, muddy ground revealed dozens of those distinctive tracks, circling the cabin, along with drag marks leading back toward the northern woods. The severed hand was gone, taken back by its deliverers, but a smear of blood remained on the window glass. I photographed it, then scrubbed it away with bleach. My morning radio check-in received an unexpected response. Stand by for call from Research Division, Ranger Rivers. Minutes later, a new voice came through. Female, authoritative, with the clipped precision of someone accustomed to emergency situations. Ranger Rivers. This is Dr. Rebecca Winters, Department of Interior Special Research Division. I understand you've had an encounter with the local wildlife. With all due respect, Doctor, what I encountered wasn't wildlife. At least, not any classified species. I'm sending you secure access to file server Romeo Sierra 404. Review those materials and call back on the encrypted channel detailed in the access package. Do not discuss this on standard frequencies. An hour later, I sat stunned before my laptop, scrolling through hundreds of incident reports, photographs, tissue samples analyses, and audio recordings spanning decades. The government hadn't just known about these creatures. They had been studying them since at least the 1970s, using remote ranger stations like Blackwater as both observation posts and bait. The encrypted call connected with a soft beep. I assume you've reviewed enough to understand the situation, Dr. Winters said without preamble. You're using rangers as research subjects, I replied, my voice tight with controlled anger, placing us in proximity to known predators without informed consent. The consent forms you signed included provisions for undocumented regional ecological factors, she countered. Legal semantics aside, your encounter provides valuable data. The hand delivery particularly, that's new behavior. 3 men are dead, presumed dead, she corrected, and they entered restricted areas despite clear warnings. Our priority is understanding these creatures while maintaining public safety through containment. What exactly are they? I asked. Silence stretched before she answered. Officially, they don't exist. Unofficially, we classify them as hominid anomalous primates. The local indigenous population called them Tornak, meaning spirit. Early trappers and gold prospectors reported encounters with wild men of the woods. Modern cryptozoologists use terms like Sasquatch or Bigfoot. None are accurate. You're saying they're some kind of undiscovered primate? I'm saying they're something far more significant. Potentially a divergent human evolutionary branch that developed in isolation. They possess rudimentary tool use, complex social structures, and possibly language. They're also territorial, powerful, and demonstrably hostile to human encroachment. I processed this information while staring at tracks visible from my window. The previous rangers, what happened to them? Mixed results. Some completed their rotations without incident. Others experienced observation only. A few had direct encounters resulting in various outcomes. Various outcomes, meaning casualties, meaning data points, she replied coolly. Your predecessor, for instance, provided excellent recording of vocalizations before his unfortunate disappearance. I closed my eyes, remembering the half-eaten lunch in the drifting boat. Why maintain this outpost if you know the danger? Containment, she repeated. Every established territory kept under observation is territory we can declare restricted to public access. The alternative is civilian encounters without monitoring or control. I wasn't prepared for this, I said. Few are, but you're ideal for this assignment. Wilderness experience, scientific background, recent personal trauma making you less risk-averse. Most importantly, you demonstrated remarkable composure during your encounter. Many would have panicked. The observation disturbed me because she was right. Despite everything, some part of me had responded to the creatures with fascination rather than just terror. What happens now? I asked. You continue your regular duties. Document any encounters thoroughly using the secure system. We'll extract you if danger becomes imminent. Meanwhile, the search for the missing hikers provides official cover for increased surveillance in the region. A research team will establish remote observation equipment while conducting the search. After disconnecting, I spent hours reviewing the files, particularly incident reports from previous Blackwater Rangers. The pattern was clear: initial observation from distance, escalating to territory testing, then direct challenges. Those who stood their ground without showing fear tended to survive longer than those who displayed weakness. The file included autopsy photos of a ranger killed in 1983, massive crushing trauma to the skull, defensive wounds on forearms, bite marks showing dentition unlike any known primate. What truly unsettled me were the psychological assessments. Rangers who survived extended contact showed cognitive changes, increased paranoia, territorial behavior, and disturbing notes about understanding their perspective. One ranger's final report before requesting transfer simply stated, "They're more right than we are." That afternoon, the research team arrived by helicopter. 4 personnel in unmarked black uniforms, loaded with equipment. Their leader, a hard-faced man who introduced himself only as Miller, briefed me with military efficiency. "We're establishing a perimeter of motion-activated cameras and audio recorders. Your cabin serves as the control center. We'll be on site for 48 hours. Then extract with any recovered evidence from the missing hikers." "You're not seriously searching for survivors," I observed. Miller's expression remained neutral. "Official mission parameters include search and rescue. Actual objectives are classified beyond your clearance." They worked methodically, placing devices in concentric circles around Blackwater. I noticed they carried heavy firepower, not standard Park Service issue, but military-grade weapons with specialized ammunition. As dusk approached, Miller ordered his team back to the cabin. "They're more active after dark. We continue deployment tomorrow." That night, we observed the creatures through thermal imaging as they investigated the newly placed devices. Their heat signatures burned bright against cold forest backdrop. Massive bodies moving with surprising grace, communicating through gestures and low vocalizations just below human hearing range. 14 distinct individuals, Miller noted, marking their positions on a digital map. "Larger population than previously documented in this territory." "They're organized," I said, watching how systematically they examined our equipment. "They're not just investigating, they're mapping our surveillance." Miller nodded grimly. "They learn. Each encounter makes them more adapted to human technology and tactics. That's what makes them dangerous. They retain and share information across generations." Shortly after midnight, all cameras in the northeastern quadrant went dark simultaneously. Minutes later, those in the northwestern sector followed. "They're disabling the system," one of Miller's team reported, fingers flying across keyboard. "Not just triggering false alarms, actually destroying the hardware." Miller unholstered his weapon. "They've never reacted this quickly before. Previous response times allowed at least 72 hours before countermeasures." The cabin lights flickered, then died as something heavy struck the generator shed outside. Emergency power kicked in, bathing us in red auxiliary lighting. "They've targeted the power source," Miller said, voice tight. "That's new behavior." Through window slits in the security shutters, we watched thermal signatures converging on the cabin. 9 massive figures moving in coordinated formation. "Standard containment protocol is compromised," Miller announced, activating an emergency beacon. "Initiating scorched earth contingency." He removed a metal case from his equipment, revealing what looked like specialized incendiary charges. "What are you doing?" I demanded. "These specimens have displayed unprecedented adaptation rates. Standing authorization permits elimination if technological understanding exceeds containment parameters." "You're going to kill them? An undocumented species with potential evolutionary significance?" "I'm following protocol," Miller replied, checking the devices. "Preservation of secrecy outweighs scientific consideration when public exposure risk reaches critical threshold." Something massive struck the cabin roof. Not a test this time, but a deliberate attack. Metal groaned as tremendous weight compressed the structure. One of Miller's team aimed upward with his weapon, but Miller stopped him. "Hold fire. They're probing for response patterns." Another impact, from a different direction. Then another. They were systematically testing structural weak points. The radio crackled with Dr. Winter's voice. "Report status, Miller. Subject group displaying Type 5 response behaviors. Requesting authorization for full containment protocol." "Negative. New directive. Capture rather than elimination. Specimens showing accelerated adaptation require intact analysis." Miller's expression darkened. "Site security is compromised. We cannot guarantee." A deafening crash interrupted him as one of the reinforced windows buckled inward. Through the gap, a massive arm thrust inside. muscled, covered in dark hair, ending in a hand with opposable digits capable of precise manipulation. The team member nearest the window fired 3 shots. The arm withdrew, accompanied by a roar that seemed to shake the cabin's foundations. "Fall back to secure room," Miller ordered, pointing toward a reinforced door I hadn't previously noticed. "Rivers, grab the research data. Move." As we retreated, the attacks intensified. Coordinated impacts against doors and windows, each targeting structural weaknesses with frightening precision. These weren't mindless assaults, but tactical strikes. The secure room was little more than a reinforced closet with communication equipment and emergency supplies. As the heavy door sealed behind us, we heard the main entrance give way with a splintering crash. Miller activated the emergency transceiver. "Blackwater compromised. Subjects have breached primary containment. 4 personnel in secure room with limited defensive capabilities." Through the door came sounds of systematic destruction, equipment being smashed, furniture overturned, walls tested for weak points. Not random rage, but deliberate elimination of human technology. "They remember what hurt them before," Miller whispered. "They're removing potential weapons." The sound stopped abruptly, replaced by silence more terrifying than the destruction. Then came a new sound, rhythmic tapping against the secure room door. Not an attack, but communication. 3 taps, pause, 2 taps, pause, 3 taps. One of Miller's team looked up from the monitoring equipment, face pale. "That's Morse code, SOS. That's impossible," another whispered. "They've observed rescue operations," Miller said grimly. "They're mimicking without understanding." The tapping changed pattern, 3 short, 3 long, 3 short. Then repeated. "That's still SOS," I said. "That's not mimicry without understanding. That's deliberate communication." Miller shook his head. "Primates can be trained to associate symbols with rewards. This is advanced, but not consciousness as we define it." Another pattern followed. Complex, rapid. One team member translated aloud. "TAKODACOMEALONE, my name." They knew my name, could spell it, and were communicating directly to me. Miller raised his weapon toward me. "You've had previous contact." "Only what I reported," I insisted, mind racing. How did they know my name? The ranger logs? My belongings? Had they been watching longer than anyone realized? The radio activated before Miller could respond. "Extraction team inbound. ETA 20 minutes, came Dr. Winter's voice. "Status report. Subjects displaying unprecedented communication abilities," Miller reported. "Weapons still trained on me. Possible security breach involving Ranger Rivers. Elaborate, direct communication using Morse code, including knowledge of the Ranger's name." Silence then. "This changes parameters. Ranger Rivers, you are hereby drafted into Special Research Division under emergency provisions. Your new assignment is direct contact liaison." "What does that mean?" I asked. "It means," Dr. Winters replied, "you're going to talk to them." The extraction team arrived in 2 black helicopters, armed with what looked like military-grade tranquilizer systems. By then, the creatures had withdrawn into the forest, though thermal imaging showed they maintained observation positions just beyond conventional visual range. Dr. Rebecca Winters stepped from the lead helicopter. Tall, silver-haired, with the focused intensity of someone who had dedicated decades to a single pursuit. She surveyed the damaged cabin without surprise. "Interesting," she murmured, examining claw marks on the walls. "Tool used to enhance natural weapons. The reports didn't capture the sophistication." Miller emerged from the secure room, rigid with contained anger. "We lost all surveillance equipment. They specifically targeted data storage. They're learning what matters to us," Winters replied, sounding almost proud. "Ranger Rivers, walk with me." We moved toward the lakeshore, away from the others. In daylight, Blackwater Lake lived up to its name, dark waters reflecting the surrounding forest like black glass. "How much did Miller tell you?" she asked. "That they're potentially an evolutionary branch of hominids, that you've been studying them for decades." "Partially correct." She gazed across the water. "What we're dealing with isn't just an undiscovered species, but potentially a parallel evolutionary track, one that diverged from our line but developed different specializations. While we prioritized frontal lobe development, they enhanced other attributes: strength, sensory acuity, environmental adaptation." "They used Morse code," I said. "That's not environmental adaptation." "No, that's mimicry and observational learning, which makes them dangerous. They watch, learn, and adapt faster than we anticipated. What they did last night represents a quantum leap in their observed capabilities, or it represents capabilities they've always had but concealed." Winters turned sharply. "Elaborate. If they're as intelligent as you suspect, they would recognize threats and calibrate responses. Show enough intelligence to be categorized as animals needing protection, not enough to be considered a competing civilization. Her eyes narrowed. An interesting theory. It would explain certain inconsistencies in documented behaviors. She handed me a small device resembling a smartphone. This contains translation algorithms developed from their vocalizations. We've identified approximately 60 distinct sounds with consistent meaning patterns. You want me to communicate with them. I want you to make contact under controlled circumstances. You've demonstrated unusual rapport. They've singled you out specifically. For what purpose? That's what you're going to discover. She gestured toward the forest. They're watching us now. They understand hierarchies. They can see I'm the leader, which means they're evaluating my threat level. Tonight, you'll go to the stone outcropping half a mile north of here, alone, unarmed. That's suicide, I protested. If they wanted you dead, you would be. They had multiple opportunities. She tapped the device in my hand. Record everything. Learn what they want. Establish yourself as an intermediary. And if they kill me, then we implement Miller's scorched earth protocol. I've authorized limited deployment of a new compound that disrupts primate neural pathways. Painless, but effective. I looked toward the forest edge where thermal scanners showed massive figures just beyond visual range. They can probably hear us. I'm counting on it, Winters replied. They should understand the stakes. That evening, I prepared for contact. The translation device included audio recordings of their vocalizations with speculative meanings, mostly simple concepts. Danger, food, territory, stranger. I practiced producing approximations of sounds my human vocal cords could manage. At dusk, I walked alone to the designated meeting point, a flat stone outcropping, overlooking a small clearing. The extraction team had withdrawn to minimum safe distance, maintaining surveillance through long-range equipment. I carried only the translation device, a small recorder, and emergency beacon. I sat cross-legged on the stone as darkness descended, fighting every instinct screaming for me to run. Minutes stretched to an hour, then 2. Night creatures resumed normal activities, owls hunting, small mammals rustling through underbrush. Then everything went silent. A massive figure emerged from the tree line, at least 8 feet tall, walking upright though with a slight forward hunch. In the moonlight I could see it clearly. Broad-shouldered, powerful, covered in dark hair except for portions of its face and palms. The face held that unsettling mix of familiar and alien. Sloped forehead, deep-set eyes, wide nasal cavity, heavy brow ridge. But the eyes held unmistakable intelligence. It stopped 20 feet away, watching me. I remained motionless, controlling my breathing, maintaining eye contact without staring, showing neither aggression nor fear. More figures appeared behind it, 7, then 12, then more, forming a semicircle around the clearing. Some carried crude implements, wooden clubs, sharpened sticks. They made no threatening moves, simply observed. The leader, identifiable by its larger size and the deference others showed, approached to within 10 feet. It made a series of vocalizations. Low, rumbling sounds interspersed with clicks and what resembled whispered words. I consulted the translation device, attempting to match sounds with meanings. According to the algorithm, the communication approximated human/speak. Why here? I tried forming the response sounds, a deep chest rumble followed by throat clicks. The creature's head tilted, surprise or confusion. It made another series of sounds, more complex. The device couldn't translate fully but suggested. Wrong speech/human deception, true purpose. I set aside the device and spoke normally. I am Dakota. I come to understand. The creature watched me intently, then did something extraordinary. It pointed to itself and produced sounds unlike the previous vocalizations. Clearer, almost like a name. Kigatilik, it seemed to say, though my human ears likely missed subtle inflections. Then it pointed to the forest, to the mountains, to the sky, making circular gestures that encompassed everything. Kigatilik, it repeated, then pointed to itself again. I understood. The name wasn't individual but collective. They shared identity. It pointed at my chest, then made a cutting motion across its throat, followed by gestures toward the helicopters beyond the forest. The meaning seemed clear. Why should they not kill me when others brought weapons? I pointed to myself, then mimed writing, recording, watching, the activities of a researcher. I pointed to them, then to my head, indicating I wanted to learn. The creature, Kigatilik, considered this, then made an abrupt gesture. One of the others came forward, carrying something wrapped in leaves. It placed the bundle before me and retreated. I unwrapped it carefully to find a Park Service badge. Not mine, but belonging to the previous ranger who had disappeared. Beside it lay what appeared to be a crude map drawn on birch bark, showing Blackwater Lake, the surrounding mountains, and X marks in specific locations. Kagatalik pointed to the map, then made digging gestures. Bodies, I said aloud. Understanding? You're showing me where you buried them. More gestures, pointing to the badges, then to their heads, then making rocking motions like cradling a baby. The translation wasn't perfect, but I grasped the concept. They had killed, yes, but not without provocation. They had respected the dead with burial. They were showing capacity for ritual, for symbolic thought, for concepts of right and wrong. They were demonstrating personhood. For the next hour we engaged in this halting communication. I learned they distinguished themselves from animals, had concepts of territory and kinship, understood death as permanent. Most importantly, they recognized humans as similar to themselves, different but thinking beings rather than mere prey or threat. What became increasingly clear, they wanted acknowledgement, not merely to exist undisturbed, but to be recognized as rightful inhabitants with territorial claims. As our session ended, Kigatilik approached closer than before. It, or perhaps more accurately, they, extended a massive hand toward me, palm up. A gesture of peace, but also a test. I placed my hand on theirs, my palm dwarfed by theirs. Their skin was calloused but warm, mammalian, alive, not so different from my own. Kigatilik made one final communication, gesturing to the south, where human civilization began, making a blocking motion, then pointing to the northern territories and drawing a circle that included both their people and me inside it. The message was unmistakable. Keep your kind away, acknowledge our boundaries, and coexistence is possible. I nodded, pointing to myself and mimicking their circular gesture, indicating I understood and would try to convey their message. As they melted back into the forest, I activated my radio. Contact successful. I'm returning to base. Report, came Winter's terse response. They're not just intelligent, I replied, gathering the map and badge. They're people. Back at the forward operating post established near the helicopter landing zone, I debriefed Winters while a medical team checked me for injuries. They understand personhood. Theirs and ours, I explained. They have concepts of territory, death, proper treatment of bodies. They're showing us evidence of ritual thinking and symbolic representation. Winters studied the bark map. This changes everything, and nothing. If they're capable of what you described, they represent an existential competitor species, or potential allies with invaluable knowledge of environmental adaptation, I countered. They've survived here for millennia without destroying their ecosystem. She looked thoughtful. The geopolitical implications are immense. Proving the existence of another intelligent hominid species would trigger international conservation laws, indigenous rights frameworks. Scientific recognition is exactly what they're seeking, I said. They want acknowledgement as beings, not animals. What they want may be irrelevant, Winters replied. This goes beyond scientific inquiry now. The security apparatus will view them as a threat, requiring containment or elimination. They've hidden successfully for generations. They could disappear into more remote regions, not with today's satellite technology and thermal imaging. She rubbed her temples. I need to contact oversight. This may go as high as National Security Council. As she stepped away to make secured calls, Miller approached me, expression grim. You believe them, he said flatly. I believe the evidence. They display attributes of personhood. They've killed people. So have humans, throughout history. Violence doesn't negate personhood. Miller leaned closer. Winters isn't telling you everything. This isn't the first contact scenario. There have been others, in Washington state, northern Canada, parts of Russia. Always the same pattern. Initial peaceful contact followed by territorial expansion and violence when their demands weren't met. You're saying they can't be trusted? I'm saying peaceful coexistence with a competing intelligent species has no historical precedent. One always dominates or eliminates the other. He glanced toward where Winters was engaged in intense conversation via satellite phone. There are factions who believe preemptive action is the only rational response. Before I could reply, alarms triggered throughout the camp, proximity sensors detecting movement in multiple sectors simultaneously. They're approaching the perimeter, a technician announced. Miller unholstered his weapon. Defensive positions. Prepare countermeasures. Wait, I shouted above the chaos. They're not attacking. This is a demonstration. On monitors displaying perimeter camera feeds, dozens of figures had appeared at the forest edge, far more than we had documented previously. They stood motionless, simply making their presence known. They're showing us their numbers, I explained. This isn't aggression, it's communication. Winters returned, face pale. Orders from above. Maintain position, continue observation, prepare containment protocols as contingency. No engagement without direct provocation. One figure stepped forward from the tree line. Cryptid, identifiable by size and bearing. It carried a crude staff topped with what appeared to be a ranger hat. It planted this marker at the edge of the cleared area around our camp, then retreated. Boundary marking, I said. They're establishing terms, or issuing an ultimatum, Miller countered. Dawn found us at uneasy stalemate. Our camp maintaining alert status while the creatures kept visible presence just within forest cover. Winters received ongoing communication from Washington, each exchange leaving her more troubled. The situation has been classified above top secret, she informed me. Task Force Echo has been mobilized. Military response? I asked, alarmed. Containment specialists, she corrected carefully. Their mandate is minimal public exposure through any means necessary. I understood the implications. They're going to eliminate evidence, including the creatures. That decision hasn't been finalized, but it's being considered. She didn't deny it. These beings represent a fundamental challenge to humanity's place in the natural order. Some believe that challenge cannot be permitted to exist. I looked toward the forest where Cryptid's people maintain their vigil. I need to warn them. That would be treason, Ranger Rivers. Genocide is worse. Winters studied me carefully. You've developed emotional investment in their welfare. That's natural but dangerous. Their evolutionary psychology isn't human. Their thought processes, values, and social structures likely differ fundamentally from ours. Projecting human ethical frameworks onto them may be anthropomorphic fallacy, or basic respect for intelligent life. The satellite phone chirped. Winters answered, listening intently before her expression hardened. Understood. Implementing immediately. She disconnected, turning to Miller. Preparation for Operation Clean Sweep. 60-minute countdown. What's Operation Clean Sweep? I demanded. She ignored me. Addressing the assembled team. Secure all evidence. Prepare chemical deployment systems. Extraction teams in position for immediate departure. I caught her arm. You're going to kill them all. Ranger Rivers. You are relieved of duty effective immediately. Miller, secure him in the transport until departure, as Miller approached with restraints. Alarms blared again, more urgent this time. Multiple perimeter breaches, a technician shouted. They're inside the camp. Chaos erupted as figures moved through our camp with startling speed. Dark shapes flowing between buildings, disabling equipment, creating strategic confusion rather than direct confrontation. They targeted communications first, then weapons caches, then transport vehicles. Defensive formation, Miller shouted, organizing his team into a protected circle around Winters and key personnel. I used the confusion to slip away, moving toward where I'd seen Cryptid plant the boundary marker. If I could reach them, perhaps negotiate. A massive hand grabbed my shoulder from behind, yanking me into the shadow of a supply tent. I found myself face to face with Cryptid, those intelligent eyes studying me with disturbing intensity. It gestured urgently toward the forest, then mimicked running. The meaning was clear. This was rescue, not capture. My people will kill yours, I warned, gesturing toward Miller's armed team. Cryptid made a dismissive motion, pointing to the mountains, the caves, the vast wilderness. Their advantages in this environment were obvious. They knew escape routes, hidden passages, territories where humans rarely ventured. I made my decision, nodding agreement. Cryptid immediately guided me toward the forest edge, moving with surprising stealth for a creature of such size. Behind us, shots rang out, Miller's team engaging with creatures who had penetrated too close to the command center. I heard Winters shouting orders, her voice tight with controlled panic. We reached the tree line as a helicopter roared overhead, searchlight sweeping the ground. Cryptid pulled me deeper into cover, following what appeared to be a game trail but moving faster than seemed possible through dense underbrush. Other figures joined us, 3 massive forms creating protective formation around me as we moved northward, away from the confrontation. Their coordination was fluid, instinctive, suggesting deep social bonds and practiced cooperation. We traveled for hours, moving steadily uphill toward higher elevations. They maintained pace that challenged my human endurance but adjusted when I showed signs of fatigue. Twice we stopped at streams where I could drink and rest briefly before continuing. By midday we reached what appeared to be a secondary territory, a high valley nestled between mountain peaks, containing scattered rock formations forming natural shelters. Here I saw evidence of longer habitation, crude tools arranged for use, food storage systems utilizing natural refrigeration of mountain streams, even primitive artistic expressions carved into stone faces. More of their kind appeared. Females with young, adolescents, elders showing gray in their fur. Not just a hunting party, but a community. They regarded me with mixture of curiosity and wariness, Maintaining distance while Kagata led me to a central clearing. Here stood what I could only describe as a meeting place. Flat stones arranged in rough circle, with larger seat-like formation at one end. Kagata directed me to sit, then took position opposite me. Others gathered around, forming silent audience for the next hour, through halting combination of gestures, vocalizations, and drawings scratched in dirt. Kagata conveyed their history, or at least, what I could interpret of it. They had once ranged widely across northern territories, living in harmony with environment and avoiding early human settlements. As human expansion increased, they retreated to increasingly remote regions. Government exploration parties in the early 20th century encountered them, leading to first organized observation programs. What emerged most clearly, they considered these mountains their ancestral home. They had buried generations here, established territories, developed customs specific to this region, and they had watched in growing alarm as human encroachment continued despite established boundaries. The missing hikers had violated deep territory containing burial grounds. The creatures had warned them repeatedly before taking action. The same pattern applied to previous disappearances of people who ignored warnings. Through crude but effective timeline indicators, Kagata conveyed something that chilled me. They had observed government research teams for decades, understanding more than we realized. They recognized patterns of study followed by elimination attempts. They had survived multiple clean sweep operations through superior environmental knowledge, but each time, their numbers diminished. Each time, they lost more territory. My presence represented opportunity for different approach, communication rather than conflict. They had recognized something in me, perhaps my partial indigenous heritage, perhaps my individual temperament, that suggested potential for understanding. As this extraordinary council concluded, Kagata made a final communication, pointing to me, then to human territories, then drawing connecting line between us and them. They were offering alliance, with me as intermediary. Before I could respond, distant sounds carried across the valley. Helicopter rotors approaching. They had tracked us. Kagata reacted with remarkable speed, directing community members toward hidden escape routes. But rather than joining them, it beckoned me to follow toward what appeared to be cave entrance concealed behind waterfall. Inside stretched network of passages, some natural, others showing signs of enlargement through tool use. Ancient pictographs covered walls in certain chambers, depicting what appeared to be their history, including early interactions with humans. Deeper we traveled, descending into earth where temperature remained constant regardless of surface conditions. The passage eventually opened into vast cavern illuminated by shafts of light from surface openings and what appeared to be bioluminescent fungi. Here stood what I could only describe as archive. Hundreds of collected human objects arranged in apparent classification system. Tools, weapons, clothing, books, electronic devices. Some items appeared decades old, others relatively recent. All were organized with clear purpose, not random collection but deliberate preservation. Kagata led me to section containing what appeared to be government identification, badges, credentials, documents spanning decades of research programs. Each represented human who had participated in studying them. Each represented knowledge they had acquired about their observers. But what truly shook me was central display. Photographs, reports, maps showing government facilities dedicated to this research. They had not merely been passive subjects, they had conducted their own parallel study of us. Kagata pointed to documents dating back to 1950s, Project Wildman, Operation Folklore, names assigned to government programs investigating unclassified hominids. The record showed pattern of initial scientific interest followed by security assessments and, ultimately, elimination attempts. The creatures had preserved evidence of these operations, spent shell casings, tranquilizer darts, even containers that appeared to have held chemical agents. They understood exactly what had been done to them, what was likely coming again. As helicopter sounds grew louder overhead, Kagata made series of urgent gestures, pointing to back passages, indicating escape route, then pointing to the archives. The choice became clear. I could flee with them deeper into territory where pursuit would be difficult, or I could remain with this evidence, bringing truth to light. Kagata watched me decide, those ancient eyes holding wisdom accumulated through generations of survival against increasing threats. It had shown me trust by revealing their knowledge, their history, their struggle. Now it offered choice. "I'll stay," I said aloud, though words meant little. "I'll tell your story." Kagata nodded, a remarkably human gesture that underscored our shared ancestry. It placed massive hand briefly on my shoulder and what felt unmistakably like blessing, then turned and disappeared into darkness of deeper passages. I gathered key documents, photographs, and most compelling evidence, securing them in waterproof bag before making my way back toward surface. Helicopter spotlights now swept valley systematically, accompanied by search teams visible on ridgelines. My radio had been taken during initial escape, but I knew they would be monitoring emergency frequencies. I activated emergency beacon, stepping into clearing where I would be visible. Within minutes, Miller's team had me surrounded, weapons trained on my position. "Where are they?" he demanded. "Gone," I replied. "Deeper into systems you'll never map." Dr. Winters arrived moments later, expression unreadable. "You've compromised national security, Ranger Rivers. The penalties are severe. I've discovered truth that supersedes security classifications." I held up the waterproof bag. "They've been studying us as much as we've studied them. They've documented every research program, every elimination attempt. They understand exactly what's happening. Surrender those materials immediately." "No." I stood my ground. "This evidence goes public unless guarantees are made. Protected territory, recognized rights, cessation of all elimination programs." "Impossible," she said flatly. "The security implications are nothing compared to moral implications of exterminating intelligent, self-aware beings who predate our presence here." I interrupted. "They've survived decades of your clean sweeps. They'll survive this one too. But with diminishing numbers, is that the legacy you want? Systematic extermination of beings who think, feel, communicate, preserve history?" Uncertainty flickered across her face. Scientist briefly overcoming security administrator. "The decision isn't mine," she said eventually. "Make it yours." I pushed. "Be the one who changed course. I have copies of documents showing government knowledge of their intelligence dating back decades. If I disappear, those go public." Tactical stalemate descended as she weighed options. Finally, she spoke quietly to Miller, who lowered his weapon and directed his team to do the same. "You'll be debriefed at secure facility," she told me. "Your evidence will be evaluated by oversight committee." "I cannot promise more." "Then my insurance documents remain in place," I replied. As they escorted me to helicopter, I looked back at mountains silhouetted against darkening sky. Though no figures were visible, I felt their presence. Watching, evaluating, remembering, I had entered these woods, seeking escape from human connection, from the pain of loss and grief. Instead, I had found connection to something both more ancient and more profound, recognition of intelligence beyond human experience, yet fundamentally linked to our own evolutionary journey. Whatever happened next, I had become part of their story, as they had become part of mine. In wilderness where I sought isolation, I had instead discovered responsibility to beings whose existence challenged everything we believed about our place in natural order. As helicopter lifted above treeline, I glimpsed movement at forest edge, massive figures standing momentarily visible before melting back into shadows. Not farewell, but acknowledgement that our paths would cross again. The creatures of Blackwater would survive. Whether humanity was wise enough to accept their existence remained to be seen. But I had seen them. I knew their name, Kigatelik, and I would tell their story. The first thing I tell people when they ask about my job is that it's not glamorous, not even remotely. It's mostly filled with long hours in dark, isolated places, hunting things that shouldn't exist but do. My name is Luke Brenton, and I'm part of a secret unit funded by the U.S. government, tasked with hunting down cryptids, those elusive, often terrifying creatures whispered about in local legends. Think Bigfoot or the Chupacabra, but worse. They pay us well, not for the danger itself, but for the secrecy. No one can know these things are real, not the public, not the media. The government prefers the status quo. Monsters belong in fairy tales. The call came on a Tuesday evening. I was in my apartment in Arlington, Virginia, staring at the ceiling as rain hammered against the windows. Director Wilson's name flashed on my phone screen. "Brenton," I answered. "We've got a situation in Kentucky. Appalachian region. Small town called Hazard." Wilson's voice was clinical, detached. It always was when he delivered assignments. 7 hikers gone missing in the last month. Then a search party of 5 locals disappeared 3 days ago. Local authorities are getting desperate. I sat up, already reaching for the notepad on my nightstand. Any evidence? Tracks? Remains? Witness accounts? Partial footprints, unlike anything local wildlife would leave. Fabric scraps found high in trees. And one witness, a local hunter who claims he saw something pale and wrong moving through the forest at dusk. The man hasn't spoken a word since his interview with local police. I jotted down the details. "I'll need the standard kit, and a partner for this one. Weiss is already prepped. He'll meet you at Andrews Air Force Base at 0600 tomorrow. The usual cover, wildlife specialist investigating potential disease outbreak affecting local fauna." "Got it." Wilson paused, something unusual in his typically efficient briefings. "Brenton, whatever's out there, It's escalating. People are noticing. We need this handled quickly and quietly. Line went dead before I could respond. I stared at my phone for a moment, then began packing. Morning came with dreary efficiency. The military transport that carried me to Kentucky was cold and uncomfortable, but I'd learned to sleep almost anywhere. Jackson Weiss was waiting when we landed, his tall frame leaning against a nondescript black SUV. "Brenton," he nodded, offering a firm handshake. "Been a while." "8 months," I replied, tossing my gear in the back. "That business in Oregon," Weiss grimaced. "Don't remind me. Still can't look at caves the same way." We drove in comfortable silence for a while, the kind that comes from shared trauma. Weiss was ex-military, special forces, recruited into our unit 5 years before me. His weathered face carried a deep scar from his right eyebrow to his jaw, a souvenir from a particularly nasty hunt in Montana. I'd never asked about it, and he'd never volunteered the story. "Read the file?" he asked eventually, eyes fixed on the winding Appalachian road ahead. "Most of it. 7 hikers, 5 search party members, all gone without a trace." I flipped through the folder Wilson had provided. Local authorities reported unusual weather patterns in the area too. Sudden temperature drops, unexplained mist, classic signs, Weiss muttered. "You think it's another skinwalker variant?" I studied the photos of the missing persons. Young, old, male, female, no discernible pattern. Too indiscriminate for a skinwalker. They usually fixate on a type. This feels hungrier, less methodical. The landscape changed as we drove deeper into Kentucky. The cities gave way to small towns, then to scattered rural homes, and finally to nothing but dense forest and mountains. Hazard appeared suddenly, nestled between 2 imposing ridges, like it was being slowly squeezed by the wilderness around it. It was nearly midnight when we rolled into town. The main street was deserted, street lamps casting weak, yellow pools on empty sidewalks. Store windows were dark, some boarded up entirely. A single bar showed signs of life, but even there, the patrons were few and subdued. "Feels like a town under siege," Weiss observed, slowing the SUV to a crawl. He wasn't wrong. There was a palpable tension in the air, like the whole town was collectively holding its breath. We checked into the only motel, a dreary establishment called the Pinewood Inn. The night clerk barely looked up as he handed over our keys, his eyes darting nervously to the windows as if expecting something to press against the glass. Our rooms were adjacent, with a connecting door that we immediately unlocked. Old habits. You never knew when you might need to reach your partner quickly in our line of work. I unpacked methodically, arranging my equipment with practiced precision. Standard issue firearm, a Sig Sauer P226 with custom silver alloy rounds, a hunting knife with a handle made from compressed wood ash, UV flashlights, motion sensors, medical kit. The tools of our unique trade. Weiss knocked on the connecting door. "Local sheriff knows we're coming. Meeting him at 0800 tomorrow at the edge of the forest where the search party was last seen." I nodded, checking my phone. No signal, of course. These remote locations were always the same, cut off, isolated. Perfect hunting grounds for the things we pursued. "Get some rest," Weiss suggested. "Tomorrow's going to be long." As I lay in the lumpy motel bed, listening to the strange creaks and settling sounds of the unfamiliar building, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Not by anything human, but by the forest itself. Like it was aware of our arrival and was already calculating how to add us to its growing list of victims. Outside, the wind picked up, branches scraping against the window like skeletal fingers seeking entry. In the distance, something howled, too deep for a wolf, too mournful for any natural creature. Tomorrow, we would enter those woods, and whatever was waiting there would be ready for us. The morning brought no comfort. A thick fog had settled over Hazard, reducing visibility to mere yards and lending an otherworldly quality to the already tense atmosphere. Weiss and I ate breakfast at the only diner in town, where locals stared at us with a mixture of suspicion and desperate hope. "You the government men?" asked our waitress, a woman in her 50s with deep lines etched around her eyes. Her name tag read Betty. "Wildlife specialists," Weiss answered smoothly. "Here to investigate some unusual animal behavior." Betty's hand trembled slightly as she refilled our coffee cups. "It ain't no animal," she whispered. "Animals don't take people like that. Animals don't make folks afraid to open their windows at night." I leaned forward. "Have you seen anything unusual yourself, ma'am?" She glanced around nervously, then bent closer. 3 nights ago, I was closing up here, saw something moving across the road toward the forest. It was tall, taller than any man I ever saw. Walked all wrong, like its joints weren't put together right. She straightened suddenly, as if remembering herself. "But you didn't hear that from me. People around here don't talk about it." Bad luck. Sheriff Dean Green met us at the forest edge as planned. He was younger than I expected, maybe early 40s, but with the haunted look of a man who'd aged a decade in a matter of weeks. Dark circles ringed his eyes, and his uniform hung loosely on his frame, suggesting recent weight loss. Figured they'd send someone eventually, he said by way of greeting, not bothering with handshakes. Though I expected more of you. We're just the advance team, I lied. Assessment only, Green snorted. Sure. Well, I hope you boys are better prepared than you look. He gestured toward the dense tree line. The search party went in right here, following the trail of the missing hikers. They had radios, supplies, weapons, all experienced outdoorsmen. They reported back hourly until about 3 p.m. Then nothing. Did they report anything unusual before they went silent? Weiss asked. Already scanning the forest edge, Green hesitated. Last transmission was garbled. Something about the trees moving when there wasn't any wind. Then one of them, Jim Hollis, been hunting these woods since he was 10. He started screaming about faces in the bark. Then static. I exchanged a glance with Weiss. Hallucinations often preceded encounters with certain types of cryptids that emitted psychoactive compounds as a hunting mechanism. You have a map of the area? I asked. Green produced a topographical map from his vehicle, spreading it across the hood. They were here when they went dark, he said, pointing to a spot about 3 miles in. There's a small clearing near a rock formation locals call the Widow's Teeth. Beyond that, the forest gets thicker, older. Folks don't typically go that far in. Any local legends about the area? Weiss inquired casually. Old stories, warnings passed down. The sheriff's face hardened. My grandmother used to talk about something in those woods. The miners had stories too, back when the coal industry was booming here. They'd speak of men going missing from camps, of something that would imitate human voices to lure people deeper into the trees. He folded the map abruptly. But those are just stories. I could tell from his expression that he no longer believed they were just stories. We geared up methodically, checking our weapons and equipment. I activated a small GPS locator and provided Green with the receiving unit. If we don't report back by nightfall, don't send anyone else in. Call this number instead. I handed him a card with Director Wilson's direct line. Green studied the card, then tucked it into his pocket. You know what's out there, don't you? We have theories, Weiss answered noncommittally. The sheriff looked between us, then at the waiting forest. Good luck, he said finally. You're gonna need it. The transition from open air to forest was immediate and disorienting. The fog seemed thicker beneath the canopy, swirling between tree trunks in unnatural patterns. Sound behaved strangely too, some noises muffled, others amplified. Our footsteps were oddly loud, while birdsong seemed distant and warped. Notice anything? Weiss murmured after we'd been walking for about 20 minutes. I nodded. No wildlife, no squirrels, no deer signs. The forest felt abandoned, as if the natural inhabitants had fled. We followed the search party's trail, which was surprisingly easy to track. Broken branches, footprints, occasional equipment. A water bottle, a torn backpack, mapped their progress. Too easy, perhaps, like something wanted us to follow. The deeper we went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The trees grew closer together, their branches intertwining overhead until barely any light penetrated. The fog took on a yellowish tinge, carrying a subtle scent I couldn't quite place. Something like wet soil mixed with copper and decay. 2 hours in, we found the first body. It was wedged between 2 trees, arms and legs twisted at impossible angles, as if the person had been forcibly stuffed into the space. The face was contorted in an expression of pure terror, eyes wide and mouth stretched in a silent scream. But what disturbed me most was the lack of blood. The body showed signs of massive trauma, crushed ribs, shattered limbs, yet there was no blood anywhere. It's been drained, Weiss observed clinically, examining the corpse's ashen skin. Completely. I checked the man's identification. Roy Mercer, 42, part of the search party. I photographed the scene, noting the strange marking on the bark near the body, a series of deep gouges that formed no recognizable pattern but seemed deliberate. Look at this, Weiss called from a few yards away. He stood before another tree, this one with a large misshapen knot in its trunk. Does this look like a natural formation to you? I approached cautiously. The knot bulged outward, its surface smooth and oddly moist. As I drew closer, I realized with a shock that it resembled a human face. Eyes closed, mouth slightly open, as if caught mid-breath. Don't touch it, I warned, just as Weiss extended his hand toward the formation. Wasn't planning to, he replied grimly. But I think I know what we're dealing with. Before he could elaborate, a sound echoed through the trees, a distant plaintive call that might have been human, might have been something else entirely. Help, please. Anyone. We froze. Weapons raised. The voice came again. Closer this time, from a different direction. Help me. I'm hurt. It's mimicking, Weiss whispered. Classic lure technique. I nodded, throat tight. We'd encountered mimics before, but something about this voice raised the hairs on my neck. It sounded too perfect, too human, like it wasn't just imitating words but understanding the emotion behind them. We pressed forward, more cautious now, moving from tree to tree for cover. The fog thickened until visibility dropped to less than 10 feet. Strange shapes loomed and receded in the mist, some tree-like, others more fluid, more wrong. The clearing with the widow's teeth appeared suddenly, the fog parting just enough to reveal a cluster of jagged rock formations jutting from the ground like enormous fangs, and strewn across the clearing, in a display so horrific it momentarily stopped my breath, were the remains of the rest of the search party. They had been dismembered, limbs arranged in a crude circular pattern around a central point, torsos stacked one atop another like macabre building blocks. But most disturbing were the heads, each mounted on a crude spike fashioned from a branch, eyes removed, mouths stuffed with what appeared to be moss and small stones. Jesus, Weiss breathed, forgetting protocol in the face of such deliberate savagery. I scanned the clearing, weapon ready. This isn't random predation. This is ritual. In the center of the circle, something dark and viscous pooled on the ground, bubbling slightly as if heated from below. The soil around it was discolored, stretched, and warped like melting plastic. Weiss crouched at the edge of the circle, careful not to step inside. This isn't just about feeding, he said quietly. It's marking territory. Sending a message. To what? Other predators? To us. Weiss stood, his expression grim. It knows we're here. As if summoned by his words, the fog behind us shifted, parting slightly to reveal a shape moving among the trees. Tall, unnaturally thin, its movements jerky and disjointed like a marionette controlled by an unskilled puppeteer. It paused, and though I couldn't make out details in the mist, I felt its attention focus on us with predatory intensity. Don't run, Weiss murmured, slowly raising his weapon. Running triggers the chase response. I nodded, my own gun trained on the shadowy figure. On 3? But before Weiss could respond, the shape melted back into the fog, disappearing as suddenly as it had appeared. The forest fell silent. Not even the wind disturbed the leaves. The stillness was absolute, suffocating. Then, from directly above us, came the sound of wood creaking, branches straining. We looked up simultaneously. The thing was in the trees, its pale body wrapped around a massive branch like some grotesque serpent, watching us with eyes that reflected the dim light like pools of oil. And it was smiling. I fired first, the shot deafeningly loud in the quiet forest. The creature jerked as the bullet hit, but made no sound. Instead, it unwound from the branch with fluid grace that belied its earlier awkward movements, dropping to the ground just yards from where we stood. Up close, it was even more wrong. Its body was humanoid but stretched, limbs too long and too thin, joints bending in directions they shouldn't. The skin was not skin at all, but something like bark or hide, pale and mottled with darker patches that shifted and swirled as if alive. The face was the worst part, almost human, with features that seemed to slide and resettle as I watched, never quite settling into a fixed arrangement. Weiss fired twice, both shots hitting the creature's torso. Black fluid oozed from the wounds, but the thing showed no sign of pain or distress. Instead, it cocked its head, studying us with what looked disturbingly like curiosity. Run, it said suddenly, the word perfectly formed but hollow, as if spoken into an empty metal container. Run, 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 run. The voice was wrong. Not a single voice at all, but a layered chorus of different tones and pitches, like multiple people speaking in unison. It's learned language, Weiss said, his own voice tight with controlled fear. That's rare. The creature's head snapped toward him, neck extending unnaturally. Rare, it repeated, drawing out the vowel until the word became a low, wet gurgle. I took aim again, targeting what I hoped was a vital area. Back away slowly, I instructed Weiss, toward the rocks. We began to retreat, weapons trained on the creature, which watched our movement with predatory focus. It followed, matching our pace exactly, maintaining the same distance between us. It's hurting us, Weiss realized aloud. As he spoke, I became aware of movement in my peripheral vision. More shapes emerging from the fog, similar to the first but smaller, moving with the same unsettling, jerky gait. 3, 4, 5 of them, approaching from different angles, cutting off potential escape routes. They're coordinating, I said grimly. Pack hunters, the largest creature, the one we'd first encountered, made a sound like branches breaking, its mouth stretching impossibly wide to reveal rows of teeth. not sharp like a predator's, but flat and ridged like grinding stones. It stepped forward, and the others froze, awaiting some signal. I remembered my training. Cryptid packs often had hierarchies, with dominant individuals directing the hunt. Take out the leader, and the others might scatter. In one fluid motion, I switched my aim to the creature's head and fired 3 rapid shots. 2 hit their mark, punching through what should have been the brain case. The creature staggered but didn't fall. Instead, it made that terrible branch-breaking sound again, louder this time. All around us, the forest seemed to respond, trees creaking, the ground vibrating slightly beneath our feet. The smaller creatures began to close in, moving with newfound urgency. "The rocks!" Weiss shouted, already backing toward the Widow's Teeth formation. "We need higher ground." We retreated quickly, firing controlled bursts to keep the creatures at bay. They were wary of the weapons but not frightened, testing our defenses, looking for weaknesses. We reached the rock formation and climbed, the rough stone providing decent handholds. The creatures watched, but didn't immediately follow, circling the base instead. From our elevated position, we had a better view of what we were facing. The smaller ones numbered 7 in total, each slightly different from the others, some more humanoid, some more animal-like, all sharing that same disturbing quality of wrongness. The leader remained slightly apart, still watching us with that unnervingly intelligent gaze. "What do you make of them?" Weiss asked, reloading his weapon. I studied the creature's behavior, their strange, shifting forms. Some kind of mimic, obviously, but more evolved than anything we've encountered before. They're showing pack tactics, language acquisition, tool use. I nodded toward one of the smaller ones, which was probing the rock face with what looked like a sharpened branch. "The question is, are they native or invasive?" Weiss mused. It was a good question. Some cryptids had evolved alongside humans, adapting to hunt us specifically. Others were intrusions from elsewhere, places our science hadn't classified yet. The leader creature suddenly went still, its head tilted as if listening. The others immediately mimicked the posture, creating an eerie tableau of identical, unnatural stillness. Then, without warning, they melted back into the fog, disappearing so completely it was as if they'd never been there at all. "What just happened?" Weiss whispered. I scanned the forest edge, uneasy. "They're not retreating. They're regrouping." As if to confirm my assessment, a distant howl echoed through the trees, the same too deep, too mournful sound I'd heard from the motel the night before. It was answered by similar calls from different directions, suggesting the pack was spreading out, encircling us. "They're more intelligent than we thought," I said grimly. "They're using strategy." Weiss checked his ammunition. "We need to even the odds. Draw them into terrain that favors us." I nodded toward the deeper forest. The reports mentioned a cave system near here. Restricted movement corridors, potential choke points. "Caves mean limited escape routes," Weiss warned. "True, but it also means they can only come at us from one direction." I calculated the risks. "It's our best option." We descended carefully from the rocks, weapons ready, senses straining for any sign of the creatures. The fog had thinned slightly, offering better visibility, but that was small comfort. The creatures had proven they could appear and disappear at will. We moved quickly but cautiously, following the map toward where the cave system should be. The forest grew denser, the trees older and larger, their massive roots creating natural barriers and trenches. Perfect ambush territory. "Listen," Weiss said suddenly, stopping short. At first I heard nothing. Then I caught it, a rhythmic sound, like liquid dripping onto hollow wood. It came from everywhere and nowhere, impossible to pinpoint. "They're paralleling us," I whispered, staying just out of sight. As we pressed forward, signs of the creature's presence became more obvious. Strange markings carved into tree trunks, small animal carcasses arranged in geometric patterns, more of those disturbing face-like knots in the bark, each one more defined than the last, some with recognizable human features. "They're changing the forest," Weiss observed, his voice tight. "Remaking it." I'd seen similar behavior in other cryptids, territory marking taken to an extreme, where the creature physically alters its environment to suit its nature, but never on this scale. The cave entrance appeared ahead, a dark mouth in a hillside partially concealed by hanging vines. As we approached, I noticed unusual formations around the opening, rocks and branches arranged in patterns too regular to be natural, creating a kind of crude doorway. "They've been using this place," I realized aloud. Weiss nodded grimly. "Home territory. Risky. No choice now," I replied, checking the UV flashlight attached to my weapon. "They know we're here." As if in response to my words, a chorus of those hollow, branch-breaking calls erupted from the forest behind us. Closer now. Urgent. "They're coming," Weiss said unnecessarily. We entered the cave, flashlights cutting through the gloom. The passage narrowed quickly, forcing us to proceed single file. The walls were wet, glistening with some viscous substance that wasn't quite water. It smelled like decay and something else, something chemical and sharp. The tunnel opened into a larger chamber, and we stopped short at the sight that greeted us. The walls were covered in what looked like cocoons, translucent, membranous sacs attached to the rock face. Inside each one, a human shape was visible, suspended in liquid, features blurred but recognizable as the missing hikers. "Are they alive?" Weiss whispered, moving closer to examine the nearest cocoon. I played my light over the form inside. No movement, no sign of respiration. "I don't think so. Not anymore." The cocoons weren't random. They were arranged in concentric circles around a central point where the cave floor dropped away into a pit. The edge of the pit was lined with those same strange markings we'd seen on the trees outside. "It's a nest," I said, the realization turning my blood cold. "Or a hatchery." Weiss stepped closer to the pit, shining his light down. "Brenton, you need to see this." At the bottom of the pit, perhaps 15 feet down, lay a mass of writhing, pale forms, miniature versions of the creatures we'd encountered, crawling over each other in a seething pile. Dozens of them, each about the size of a human infant. "They're breeding," Weiss said, his voice steady despite the horror of what we were witnessing. The implications were staggering. If these things could reproduce at this rate, using human hosts as some kind of incubation mechanism, the threat was far greater than we'd anticipated. "We need to destroy this place," I said firmly. "All of it." Weiss was already reaching for the incendiary charges in his pack when a sound from the tunnel made us both turn. The leader creature stood in the entrance, its body contorted to fit through the narrow opening, those shifting, never quite settled features focused on us with unmistakable intent. Behind it, more shapes crowded the tunnel. The entire pack, driven by some instinct to protect their young. "Intruders," the leader said in that layered, chorus-like voice. "Threat. Danger." Each word was precisely articulated but emotionless, like it was testing language it had only recently acquired. "Set the charges," I told Weiss, raising my weapon. "I'll hold them off." The leader creature took a step forward, its limbs bending at impossible angles to navigate the uneven cave floor. "You kill us," it said, those oil-slick eyes fixed on my face. "We kill you. Fair." The word choice sent a chill through me. This wasn't just mimicry. It understood concepts, ideas. How long had it been watching humans, learning from us? "What are you?" I asked, curiosity momentarily overriding caution. The creature's face rippled, features rearranging into something that might have been a smile on a human face but was deeply wrong on its alien visage. "We are becoming," it answered, and lunged. I fired instinctively, the muzzle flash illuminating the creature's twisted form in stark relief. The bullets found their mark, punching through its pale, bark-like skin. But the creature barely slowed. It crossed the distance between us with unnatural speed, one elongated arm sweeping toward my head with devastating force. I ducked, the blow grazing my shoulder instead of my skull, but even that glancing contact sent me sprawling. Pain exploded across my upper body, the limb instantly numb. The creature loomed over me, that terrible almost smile widening to reveal more of those flat, grinding teeth. Behind it, the rest of the pack began to pour into the chamber, their bodies twisting and contorting to fit through the narrow entrance. Some crawled along the ceiling, defying gravity in a way no natural being could. "Weiss!" I shouted, scrambling backward, trying to put distance between myself and the leader. Weiss had positioned himself near the pit, incendiary charges ready. "On it!" he called back, voice tight with concentration. The leader creature cocked its head, those oil-slick eyes shifting from me to Weiss, understanding dawning in its inhuman gaze. It made a high, keening sound that sent the smaller creatures into a frenzy. They swarmed toward Weiss, moving in perfect coordination. I fired again, aiming for the leader's limbs, trying to slow it down. The creature jerked as bullets tore through its extremities, black fluid spattering the cave floor. But it kept coming, moving differently now, lower to the ground, more animal than human in its gait. Weiss was holding his own, his larger frame and military training serving him well as he fended off the smaller creatures with controlled bursts of gunfire. But there were too many, coming too fast. One latched onto his leg, mouth opening impossibly wide to reveal those grinding teeth. Weiss cried out in pain but didn't falter, kicking the thing away with enough force to send it crashing against the far wall. The leader was on me again, moving faster than something its size should be able to, its limbs elongating and contracting in nauseating ways that defied anatomy. I switched tactics, dropping my gun and drawing the hunting knife from my belt. The silver alloy blade gleamed in the harsh light of our flashlights. The creature paused, its gaze fixed on the knife. Something like recognition flashed across its ever-shifting features. "You know what this is," I realized aloud. "You've seen it before." The thing made a low, rumbling sound deep in what passed for its chest. "Old weapon," it said, those chorus-like voices overlapping in dissonant harmony. Memory and skin. I didn't have time to process the implications of that statement. The creature lunged again, but this time I was ready. I sidestepped, driving the knife into what should have been its shoulder. The blade sank deep, meeting less resistance than I expected, as if the thing's interior was partly hollow. The creature shrieked, a sound like metal tearing, and black fluid gushed from the wound. It thrashed, trying to dislodge the blade, its limbs whipping around with bone-breaking force. I held on, using the knife as an anchor, and drove my other fist into what passed for the thing's face. Across the chamber, Weiss had managed to place several charges around the pit's edge. He was bleeding from multiple wounds, his uniform torn, but his movements were still precise, professional. He caught my eye and nodded, the signal that he was ready. I twisted the knife deeper into the leader creature's body, eliciting another of those metal-tearing shrieks. The sound seemed to disorient the smaller creatures, making them hesitate in their attack. I used the moment to disengage, yanking the knife free and rolling away from the leader's reach. "Now!" I shouted to Weiss. Weiss hit the detonator. The first charge exploded with a concussive blast that shook the entire chamber, sending rocks and dust cascading from the ceiling. The creatures screeched in unison, the sound painful to human ears. The second and third charges followed in quick succession, their explosions directed downward into the pit. The floor beneath us began to crack, fissures spreading outward from the pit like a spiderweb. The creatures panicked, abandoning their coordinated attack in favor of self-preservation, scrambling toward the exit tunnel. The leader remained, however, its oil-slick eyes fixed on me with what looked disturbingly like hatred, a human emotion on an inhuman face. "Not end," it said, its layered voice somehow audible over the rumble of collapsing rock. "Never end. We are many. We are becoming." The fourth charge detonated, and this time the floor gave way entirely. The pit widened, swallowing cocoons and creatures alike. The leader stood at the edge, perfectly balanced despite the destruction around it. For a moment I thought it would leap for me, continue the fight despite everything. Instead, it did something far more disturbing. It smiled. A genuine smile, not the grotesque approximation from before, and spoke one final time. "See you again, Luke Brenton." Then it stepped backward into the widening pit, disappearing into the darkness below. "Move!" Weiss shouted, grabbing my arm. "This whole place is coming down." We ran for the exit tunnel, dodging falling debris and the few remaining smaller creatures that blocked our path. The tunnel itself was beginning to collapse, the walls squeezing inward as the mountain above shifted. We pushed forward, lungs burning, muscles screaming, the rumble of destruction following close behind. We burst from the cave entrance just as it collapsed completely, a cloud of dust and pulverized rock billowing out behind us. The force of the implosion knocked us forward, sending us tumbling down the hillside in a tangle of limbs and equipment. When we finally stopped rolling, I lay on my back, staring up at the forest canopy, every part of me aching. Beside me, Weiss coughed violently, trying to clear the dust from his lungs. "Did we get them all?" he managed between coughs. I sat up slowly, wincing at the pain in my shoulder where the creature had struck me. The entire hillside had changed shape, the cave entrance now nothing more than a pile of rubble. Smoke rose from cracks in the earth, carrying that same strange chemical smell. "The nest is destroyed," I said, not quite answering his question. I couldn't shake the memory of the leader's final words, the way it had spoken my name with such familiarity. Weiss struggled to his feet, offering me a hand up. "We should call in the cleanup team. They'll want to quarantine this whole area." I nodded, retrieving my satellite phone from my pack, which had somehow survived our headlong flight from the cave. The call was brief, just the code word that would bring in the specialized team to contain the site and eliminate any evidence of what had happened here. As I put the phone away, Weiss was scanning the forest, his expression troubled. "Something's not right," he said quietly. I followed his gaze. At first I saw nothing unusual, just trees and undergrowth, the late afternoon light filtering through the canopy. Then I noticed it, the silence, no birds, no insects, not even the rustling of leaves in the wind. The forest was completely, unnaturally still. "They're watching us," Weiss said, giving voice to my own thoughts. I remembered what the creature had said. "We are many." How many more were out there, hidden in the woods, observing us with those oil-slick eyes? And what had it meant by, "we are becoming"? "We need to get back to town," I said, checking the position of the sun to orient myself. Before dark, we moved quickly but cautiously, aware that we were likely being followed, observed. The forest seemed different on the return journey. The trees closer together than I remembered, the paths less distinct. More than once, I caught glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision, only to find nothing when I turned to look directly. The sun was setting by the time we reached the forest edge, bathing everything in blood-red light that did nothing to ease the sense of wrongness that had settled into my bones. Sheriff Green was waiting where we'd left him, pacing nervously beside his vehicle. His face registered shock when he saw our condition, clothes torn and filthy, covered in dust and what was probably the creature's black fluid, both of us sporting various cuts and bruises. "What the hell happened in there?" he demanded as we approached. "Situation contained," Weiss replied tersely. "For now." Green looked past us toward the forest, his expression darkening. "For now? What does that mean?" I was about to respond when movement caught my eye. A flicker of pale, bark-like skin between distant trees, there and gone so quickly I might have imagined it. "It means we're not done here," I said grimly. "But we've bought some time." As we drove back to town in silence, I couldn't shake the leader creature's final words from my mind. "See you again, Luke Brenton." It had known my name. Somehow, it had known who I was, and I had the terrible feeling it had let me live on purpose. The cleanup team arrived before midnight. 4 nondescript black vans carrying men and women in hazmat suits, their faces hidden behind respirators, their movements efficient and practiced. They spoke little, asking only the essential questions about what we'd encountered and where. I provided GPS coordinates for the cave site and the clearing with the widow's teeth, marking them on their specialized maps. "Full containment protocol," I instructed the team leader, a stoic woman who identified herself only as Miller. "Nothing gets out, nothing gets studied in the field. Everything goes back to the facility." Miller nodded, her expression unreadable behind her mask. "Locals, sheriff knows enough to be cautious. The rest of the town suspects something but has no specifics." I hesitated, then added, "You might want to check the trees for those face-like formations. They seem to be part of how these things spread." "Noted," Miller replied. "We'll handle it from here. Director Wilson wants you and Weiss back at headquarters for debriefing ASAP." Weiss, who had been silent since our return to town, finally spoke up. "These aren't like anything we've encountered before, Miller. They're intelligent, adaptive, and they learn fast." Miller's eyes narrowed slightly, the only visible reaction through her mask. "Just do your job, Weiss. We'll do ours." The cleanup team departed immediately for the forest, their vehicles moving in silent procession through Hazard's empty streets. Locals watched from behind curtains, their faces pale and frightened, but no one approached, no one asked questions. They'd learned the value of silence. Weiss and I checked out of the Pinewood Inn, gathering our few belongings. The night clerk avoided eye contact, sliding our receipt across the counter with trembling hands. Word had spread, it seemed, not of what we'd found, but that we'd found something. "Do you think it's over?" the clerk asked suddenly as we turned to leave, his voice barely above a whisper. I looked back at him, noting the dark circles under his eyes, the pallor of sleepless nights. "Stay out of the woods," I said simply. "All of you. At least for a while." He nodded, his gaze dropping back to the counter. "Some things aren't meant to be disturbed," he murmured, almost to himself. Outside, the night was cool and clear, stars visible above the small town in a way they never were in cities. Our car was waiting, fueled and ready for the drive to the airfield where a transport would take us back to headquarters. As we loaded our gear, I scanned the tree line visible at the edge of town. Nothing moved there, but the feeling of being watched persisted. "You've been quiet," I observed as Weiss slid into the driver's seat. He started the engine before responding. "It knew your name, Brenton. It spoke directly to you." His hands tightened on the steering wheel. "In all my years doing this job, I've never seen a cryptid do that." I hadn't either, and the implications disturbed me more than I wanted to admit. Maybe it heard the sheriff use my name. Mimics pick up language quickly. Weiss shook his head. This wasn't mimicry. This was recognition. He pulled onto the main road, the headlights cutting through the darkness ahead. And what it said, "We are becoming." Becoming what? I had no answer for him. The drive to the airfield passed in contemplative silence, both of us lost in our own thoughts, processing what we'd witnessed in those woods. The military transport that awaited us was identical to the one that had brought us here. Cold, uncomfortable, and mercifully anonymous. As we settled in for the flight, exhaustion finally caught up with me. I closed my eyes, but sleep brought no refuge. I dreamed of trees with faces, of pale, twisted forms moving just at the edge of vision, of oil-slick eyes watching me with terrible intelligence. And throughout the dream, a chorus of layered voices whispered a single phrase, over and over. "We are becoming." I woke with a start as the plane touched down at Andrews Air Force Base. Dawn was breaking, casting everything in gray half-light that did little to dispel the lingering unease from my dreams. Weiss looked equally unrested, his normally alert gaze dulled by fatigue and something else. Doubt, perhaps, or worry. A car was waiting to take us directly to headquarters, a nondescript office building in Arlington that housed our unit's operations. The lobby was empty at this early hour, our footsteps echoing on polished marble as we made our way to the elevators. Biometric scanners granted us access to the lower levels, where the real work happened. Director Wilson was waiting in the debriefing room, his tall, thin frame silhouetted against the window that overlooked an interior courtyard. He turned as we entered, his expression giving away nothing. "Sit," he said, gesturing to the chairs arranged around a conference table. We complied, the action bringing fresh awareness of every bruise and strain from the previous day's encounter. Wilson remained standing, studying us with clinical detachment. "Your preliminary report makes for interesting reading," he said finally. "Intelligent mimics with pack behavior and advanced language acquisition." He paused, tapping a folder on the table. "And they knew your name, Agent Brenton." I wasn't surprised that this detail had caught his attention. "Yes, sir." The leader creature addressed me directly before the cave collapsed. Wilson's gaze sharpened. "And you believe it survived?" It wasn't a question. "I believe some of them survived, yes." The leader seemed confident even as everything was being destroyed around it. Wilson nodded thoughtfully. "The cleanup team has established a perimeter around the affected area. Initial surveys show significant alteration of the local ecosystem, those face formations on trees extending for nearly a mile in all directions from the cave site." He sat down heavily, suddenly looking tired. "We've seen territorial marking before, but nothing on this scale." "Sir," Weiss interjected, "what the lead creature said, 'we are becoming,' suggests these things are in some state of transition or evolution. If they're changing, adapting this quickly." He didn't need to finish the thought. We all understood the implications. A cryptid species with this level of intelligence and adaptability, capable of using humans as hosts for reproduction, represented a threat beyond anything we'd previously classified. "We've increased surveillance in the region," Wilson said after a moment. "Satellite monitoring, remote sensors. If these things try to expand their territory again, we'll know." He fixed me with a penetrating stare. "But I want your assessment, Brenton, off the record. What are we dealing with here?" I considered my answer carefully. "Something old, I think." The leader recognized the silver alloy knife, called it an old weapon. It spoke of memory and skin, which suggests some form of genetic or inherited knowledge. I leaned forward, hands clasped on the table, but also something new. The way it was changing the forest, the coordinated pack behavior, the language acquisition, these feel like recent adaptations, accelerated evolution, or deliberate change, Weiss added quietly. Wilson's eyebrows rose. "Deliberate? You think these creatures are consciously directing their own evolution?" "I think," Weiss said carefully, "that we shouldn't underestimate their intelligence or their intentions. They're not just predators, they're transforming their environment, creating a habitat that suits them. And they're using us somehow, not just as food, but as part of whatever they're becoming." Silence fell over the room as we all absorbed this unsettling possibility. Finally, Wilson sighed, running a hand through his thinning hair. "Get yourselves to medical," he instructed. "Full workup, decontamination protocols. I want you both cleared before you leave this building." He stood, signaling the end of the debriefing. "And Brenton," he paused, his expression softening slightly. "Be careful. If this thing has fixated on you for some reason." "I understand, sir," I replied, though in truth I wasn't sure I did. Why had the creature singled me out? What had it seen in me that had prompted that final, disturbing farewell? Medical took hours. Blood tests, tissue samples, brain scans, the works. The doctors were thorough, searching for any sign of contamination or alteration. Weiss finished before me and was cleared to leave, though he waited in the hallway, unwilling to depart until he knew I was clean too. "All clear," the lead physician finally announced, reviewing my test results one last time. "No signs of foreign biological material or psychoactive compounds. You're lucky, Agent Brenton. Most encounters this close leave some trace." I wasn't sure luck had anything to do with it, but I nodded and thanked her, gathering my belongings and joining Weiss in the corridor. "Clean bill of health?" he asked as we walked toward the exit. "Apparently," I confirmed, though I couldn't shake the feeling that the medical tests had missed something subtle, something that couldn't be detected by our current technology. Outside, the day had fully arrived. Bright sunshine, a stark contrast to the dark thoughts that had followed us from Kentucky. Weiss paused at the building entrance, turning to face me. "What now?" he asked, the question encompassing more than just our immediate plans. I shrugged. "Now we wait." For the next assignment, the next hunt. For the creature to fulfill its promise and find me again. I didn't add. Weiss studied me for a moment, then nodded. I'll see you around, Brenton. Try to get some real sleep. We parted ways there, each returning to our separate lives, our separate apartments where we would try to process what we'd seen, what we'd learned. But as I walked toward the parking lot, I couldn't escape the feeling that I was being watched. I turned, scanning the area, but saw nothing unusual. Just government workers going about their business, cars passing on the street, trees swaying gently in the breeze. Trees. I found myself staring at them, searching for faces in the bark, for any sign of that unnatural wrongness we'd encountered in Kentucky. There was nothing, of course, just ordinary trees in an ordinary urban landscape. Yet as I drove home, the feeling persisted. At traffic lights, I studied the small patches of greenery that dotted the city. Parks, median strips, solitary trees growing from cutouts in the sidewalk. Had they always grown in these particular patterns? Had that oak always had that peculiar knot in its trunk? My apartment felt alien when I finally reached it, as if in my absence it had been subtly altered. Furniture shifted by inches, shadows falling at slightly different angles than I remembered. I checked every room, every closet, telling myself I was being paranoid but unable to shake the unease that had followed me from those Kentucky woods. I showered, the hot water sluicing away the hospital's antiseptic smell, but not the memory of oil-slick eyes and that final, terrible smile. When I finally collapsed into bed, exhaustion quickly pulled me toward sleep despite my racing thoughts. Just before consciousness slipped away, I heard it. A soft sound, like branches moving in a gentle wind. My eyes snapped open, scanning the dark room, finding nothing out of place. But as sleep claimed me fully, I could have sworn I heard that layered, chorus-like voice whispering from somewhere very close. "We are becoming, Luke Brenton. And so are you." In the morning I would dismiss it as a dream, a product of stress and trauma and too many hours without proper rest. I would report for duty as usual, await my next assignment, continue the work of keeping the world safe from things it didn't believe in. But deep down I knew the truth. What we had encountered in those Kentucky woods wasn't just another cryptid to be cataloged and contained. It was something older, something changing, something with purpose and direction that we had only begun to comprehend. And somehow, it had marked me. Not as prey, but as something else entirely. The hunt wasn't over. It had only just begun. I never should have bought that house. The realtor called it a steal, but now I understand what was truly stolen. My peace, my sanity, my sense of safety in the world. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start from the beginning. The two-story Victorian on Maple Street came onto the market suddenly after sitting vacant for nearly 5 years. The price was well below market value, a fact I attributed to the dated interior and overgrown yard. I was recently divorced and eager for a fresh start, so I made an offer the same day I toured it. The seller accepted immediately. "You're making a smart investment," my realtor assured me as she handed over the keys, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. "This neighborhood is on the upswing." On moving day, I noticed my new neighbor watching from his porch across the street. Michael Anderson was a man in his 60s with a weathered face and eyes that seemed to hold something back. He approached as the movers carried in the last of my furniture. "Welcome to Maple Street," he said, extending a calloused hand. "Been a while since anyone lived in that old place." "Thanks. I'm looking forward to making it home," I replied, shaking his hand. "You might want to check the locks," he said, his voice dropping. Previous owners had some issues with security. Before I could ask what he meant, he turned and walked back to his house, leaving me with an unsettled feeling in my stomach. That first night, I attributed the creaking floorboards to the house settling. The old radiators clanged and hissed as they pushed heat through the rooms. But at 3:17 a.m., I remember the time precisely because I checked my phone. I was startled awake by a sound I couldn't immediately identify. It was a slow, deliberate scratching, like fingernails dragging across wood. It seemed to be coming from inside the wall beside my bed. I switched on the lamp and pressed my ear against the faded wallpaper. The scratching stopped immediately. Convincing myself it was just mice or perhaps branches scraping against the exterior, I returned to bed, but sleep eluded me for the remainder of the night. The next morning I explored the house more thoroughly. The previous owners had left behind odd remnants, a single woman's glove in the back of a kitchen drawer, a child's marble under the radiator in the living room, and most puzzling, a collection of newspaper clippings in the attic, all with dates spanning from 1997 to 2003, all concerning missing persons cases in neighboring counties. I told myself they were probably collected by someone with a morbid fascination for true crime. I stacked them neatly in a box, intending to dispose of them later. That afternoon, I met Rebecca, a friendly barista at the local coffee shop who'd grown up in the area. When I mentioned my new address, her smile faltered. The old Winters house? I didn't know it had sold. Do you know anything about it? I asked, watching her expression carefully. She hesitated before answering. Not really. It's been empty since I was in high school. There were some stories, but you know how small towns are. People talk. What kind of stories? Rebecca glanced around as if checking who might be listening. Well, the family that lived there last left very suddenly. No one knows why. Some say they heard things in the walls. I felt a chill despite the warmth of the coffee shop. Things like what? I don't know the details, she said, suddenly busying herself with wiping down the counter. It's probably nothing. Old houses make noise. That night the scratching returned, this time accompanied by what sounded like whispers, too faint to make out words, but distinct enough that I knew I wasn't imagining them. I got out of bed and followed the sounds to a small door in the hallway that opened to reveal a narrow staircase leading to the basement. I hadn't been down there yet. The real estate agent had mentioned it was unfinished and used only for storage. As I descended the wooden steps, each creaking underfoot, the whispers ceased. The basement was dark and smelled of damp earth and something else I couldn't identify. Something vaguely metallic. My flashlight beam revealed stone walls and a dirt floor in some areas. Old shelves lined one wall, holding dusty mason jars and forgotten tools. In the center of the room stood a large wooden table, its surface stained dark in places. Behind it, something had been scratched into the stone wall. Not random marks, but deliberate shapes that almost resembled letters in a language I didn't recognize. I approached the wall, running my fingers over the etched symbols. They felt cold to the touch, colder than the surrounding stone. As I traced one particularly complex symbol, a sharp pain shot through my fingertip. I pulled back to find a small cut, blood welling up from the wound. The drop of blood fell to the dirt floor, and in that moment, the whispers returned, louder now, almost as if directly beside my ear. I spun around, but I was alone in the basement. Heart pounding, I retreated up the stairs, slamming the door behind me. Sleep was impossible. Every noise in the house seemed amplified. The tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway, the hum of the refrigerator, the occasional groan of wood expanding and contracting. And beneath it all, barely perceptible but undeniably present, the whispers continued. Morning couldn't come fast enough. With daylight streaming through the windows, the events of the night before seemed less threatening, almost laughable. I was a grown adult frightened by an old house's normal sounds and an overactive imagination. Still, the cut on my finger was real enough, though it looked more like a clean slice than a jagged scrape. I decided to learn more about the house's history. The local historical society occupied a small building near the town square, where I met James Foster, the elderly curator with thick glasses and a tweed jacket with leather elbow patches. The house on Maple Street, he repeated, interest sparking in his pale blue eyes. That's one of our more interesting properties, built in 1887 by Edmund Carleton, a doctor who was somewhat progressive for his time. He was interested in experimental treatments for mental illness. What kind of treatments? I asked. James shuffled through some files before producing a faded photograph showing my house, as it must have looked when newly built, with a group of solemn-faced people standing on the front porch. Dr. Carleton believed in a combination of physical and psychological approaches. Some considered his methods controversial. He pointed to a figure at the edge of the photograph. After his death in 1912, the house passed to his assistant, who continued his work for some years before the property was converted to a private residence in the 1930s. Was it ever used as anything other than a home or medical facility? James studied me over the rim of his glasses. There are some records suggesting the basement was used for procedures that required more privacy. Soundproofing was added to certain rooms. He paused. May I ask why you're interested in this history? I hesitated before answering. I bought the house recently. I've been hearing some strange noises. Old houses settle, he said, but something in his tone suggested he didn't believe that explanation any more than I did. If you're really curious, you might want to check the county records for any unusual incidents at that address. Sometimes the walls of a house absorb the events that occur within them. His choice of words sent a shiver through me. On my way home, I stopped at the hardware store and purchased new locks for all the doors and windows. The clerk, an older man with grease-stained hands, asked if I was having security issues. Just being cautious, I replied. That old place on Maple? He guessed. When I nodded, he added, might want to pick up some caulk while you're at it. Those old Victorians have all kinds of gaps where things can get in. Things? Drafts. Pests, you know. He wouldn't meet my eyes as he rang up my purchases. I spent the afternoon installing the new locks, trying to ignore the persistent feeling of being watched. As I worked on the back door, I noticed something unusual about the frame. Small holes drilled at regular intervals, now filled with some kind of dark putty. They formed a complete circle around the doorway, as if someone had been trying to seal it in some way beyond normal security measures. That evening, Michael from across the street came over with a bottle of wine as a housewarming gift. "Getting settled in okay?" he asked, eyes darting past me to scan the interior of the house. "Mostly," I said, not wanting to share my concerns with someone I barely knew. "The house has some quirks. All these old places do," he agreed too quickly. "Listen, I don't mean to pry, but have you been down to the basement yet?" The question caught me off guard. "Yes, briefly. It needs a lot of work." Michael nodded, his expression unreadable. "The Winters, the last family, they did some renovations down there. Uncovered some things they probably wish they hadn't." "What things?" He took a step back. "It's not my place to say. Just be careful what you disturb. Some things are buried for a reason." After he left, I couldn't shake his warning. Despite my better judgment, I found myself drawn back to the basement door. This time, I brought better lighting, a powerful lantern that illuminated every corner of the stone chamber below. The symbols on the wall seemed more pronounced in the brighter light, almost as if they were freshly carved rather than decades or perhaps centuries old. I noticed now that they formed a perfect circle, with different markings at what appeared to be cardinal points. In the center of the dirt floor, directly beneath where the wooden table stood, I noticed a slight depression. Setting down the lantern, I moved the heavy table aside, revealing what looked like disturbed earth, as if something had been buried and then exhumed. I returned upstairs for a garden trowel I'd seen in a kitchen drawer. Something compelled me to dig, despite every instinct warning against it. The soil was surprisingly loose, giving way easily under the trowel. About 2 feet down, I hit something solid. Brushing away the dirt revealed a small metal box, roughly the size of a hardcover book. It was sealed with a simple latch, no lock. Inside was a leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with age, and a smaller box made of what appeared to be bone. The journal belonged to someone named Robert Winters, apparently from the last family who'd lived in the house. The entries started normally enough, detailing the family's excitement about moving in, initial renovation plans, meeting the neighbors. But about 3 months in, the tone shifted dramatically. "The scratching has begun again," one entry read. "Margaret insists it's just mice, but mice don't whisper. The children have started sleeping together in one room. They say they're afraid of the voices coming from inside the walls." I'm beginning to think the stories about this house might have some truth to them. Subsequent entries documented increasing paranoia and disturbing incidents, objects moving on their own, unexplained cold spots, and most alarmingly, sleepwalking episodes where family members would wake to find themselves in the basement with no memory of how they got there. The final entry, dated just days before the family's sudden departure according to local gossip, sent ice water through my veins. I found the symbols behind the old wallpaper in the basement. Research suggests there's some kind of containment circle. Dr. Carlton wasn't treating patients here. He was conducting rituals, attempting to harness something he didn't understand. I've made a terrible mistake bringing my family here. Whatever was trapped in the walls is getting out. I hear it scratching to be free. God help us all. The journal ended abruptly. With trembling hands, I opened the small bone box. Inside was a single human tooth, adult-sized, with a small hole drilled through the root as if it had once been worn as a pendant. As I held it, the whispers returned, louder than ever before, and for the first time, I could make out words among the susurrations. "Found you, found you, found you." The lantern flickered and died, plunging the basement into darkness. I scrambled up the basement stairs in total darkness, the journal clutched to my chest, the bone box left behind in my panic. I slammed the door behind me and leaned against it, heart hammering, listening for any sound of pursuit. The house had fallen eerily silent. No whispers, no scratching, not even the normal creaks and groans of the old structure. That silence was somehow more terrifying than the noises had been. I spent the night in my car, parked under the bright lights of a 24-hour supermarket parking lot. When dawn broke, I felt foolish, a grown adult sleeping in a vehicle because of some odd noises and an old journal that could easily be a hoax. But the rational light of day couldn't completely dispel the visceral fear I'd experienced. I needed answers beyond what James or the neighbors could provide. The journal mentioned research into the house's history and Dr. Carlton's activities. I needed to find whatever Robert Winters had discovered. The county records office was housed in a modern building that seemed at odds with the rest of the town's quaint architecture. The clerk was initially reluctant to help without specific dates or document numbers, but my desperation must have been evident. "I need anything related to Edmund Carlton or unusual incidents at 1887 Maple Street," I explained. "Police reports? Property disputes? What exactly are you looking for? She asked. Anything unusual? Deaths? Disappearances? Official investigations? She raised an eyebrow but began typing into her computer. After several minutes, she looked up with a frown. That's odd. There should be more records for a property that old, but many seem to be missing or sealed. She turned the screen toward me, showing a list of files with numerous gaps in the timeline. Sealed? By whom? It doesn't say. You'd need a court order to access those. She pointed to one unsealed entry. There is this, though. A police report from 1998 regarding a wellness check at that address. The report was brief but chilling. Neighbors had called the police after not seeing the residents, a family named Keller, for several weeks. Officers found the house empty, with dinner still on the table and no signs of packing or planned departure. The case was classified as a missing persons investigation, but there was no record of it ever being resolved. Does it mention any unusual features of the house, particularly in the basement? I asked. No, but she hesitated. My uncle was on the force back then. He mentioned this case once at a family dinner, said it was the strangest thing he'd ever seen, like the family had just vanished into thin air. He also said something about markings on the walls that creeped him out. I thanked her and left, stopping next at the local newspaper office to search their archives. The missing Keller family had made front-page news, with follow-up articles appearing for several weeks before the story faded away. But I found something else, a small article from 1965 about renovations uncovering unusual chambers in the basement of the house on Maple Street. The contractor quoted in the piece refused to continue work after the discovery, citing ethical concerns without elaboration. By late afternoon, I had pieced together a disturbing pattern. Every few decades, residents of the house disappeared under mysterious circumstances or fled suddenly. There were gaps in official records that made no sense unless someone was deliberately obscuring information. As I drove back to the house, resolved to pack my belongings and leave immediately, I noticed police cars parked outside. Detective Wilson, a stern-faced woman with cropped gray hair, approached as I pulled into the driveway. Are you the current owner? She asked without preamble. I nodded, a knot forming in my stomach. We've had reports of trespassing and possible vandalism. A neighbor saw lights in your basement last night and called it in, concerned since they knew you weren't home. I was home, I said. I was in the basement. She studied my face. Your car was gone all night. We checked. I left afterward, I admitted. The house, there's something wrong with it. Her expression softened slightly. Look, I've been on the force here for 20 years. That house has a reputation. If you're experiencing anything unusual, you can tell me. The words tumbled out. The noises, the journal, the symbols, the pattern of disappearances. To my surprise, she didn't dismiss my concerns. Come with me, she said, leading me to her car where she retrieved a file from the trunk. This is unofficial. I've been collecting information about that house for years, ever since the Keller case. The file contained photographs of the basement walls with the symbols clearly visible, statements from former residents describing experiences similar to mine, and most disturbingly, a photograph of Dr. Carlton standing next to the wooden table I'd found, with what appeared to be restraints visible at its corners. Carlton wasn't just a doctor, Detective Wilson explained. He was involved in a fringe movement that believed mental illness was caused by external entities that could be captured and studied. His journals, at least the ones we found, describe experiments attempting to trap these parasitic consciousnesses within the walls of the house using symbolism from various esoteric traditions. You believe this? I asked incredulously. What I believe doesn't matter. What matters is that people have disappeared in that house for over a century. The symbols are real. The pattern is real. She closed the file. My advice? Walk away. Sell the house or abandon it. Don't become another statistic. I returned home with the intention of grabbing essential belongings before checking into a hotel. The house felt different. The air heavier, the shadows deeper despite the afternoon sun streaming through the windows. As I stuffed clothes into a suitcase, I heard it, not scratching this time, but a soft thudding, like something gently beating against the inside of the walls. I froze, listening as the sound moved, traveling up the wall beside my bed, across the ceiling, and down the opposite wall, as if something was circling me. Then came a voice, not a whisper this time but clear as day, speaking directly behind me. You opened the circle. I spun around. No one was there, but the bedroom door slowly swung shut on its own. The thudding intensified, now coming from all directions at once, inside every wall. Above the ceiling, below the floor, plaster began to crack, hairline fractures spreading like spider webs across the surfaces. I ran for the door, but the handle wouldn't turn. The cracks widened, and through them, I glimpsed movement, not mice or insects, but something that seemed to flow like dark water through the spaces between the walls. My phone rang, startling me. It was Detective Wilson. "Get out now," she said without greeting. "I just found another file. The symbols aren't a containment circle, they're a door, and you opened it when you disturbed the floor." "I can't get out," I said, panic rising in my throat as I watched the cracks widen further. "The house won't let me." "There's an emergency release in the basement," she said. "Carlton built it as a failsafe. Look for a metal plate under the table." The call disconnected as pieces of plaster began falling from the ceiling. I had no choice but to head for the basement, navigating through hallways where the walls seemed to pulse with hidden movement. The basement door stood open, though I was certain I had closed it. The wooden stairs groaned under my weight as I descended into the darkness below. The lantern I'd left behind was working again, casting long shadows across the stone floor. The table had been moved back to its original position over the hole I'd dug. With strength born of desperation, I shoved it aside once more. The metal plate was there, just as Detective Wilson had described, a small bronze square with the same symbols etched into its surface that marked the walls. As I reached for it, the whispers returned, rising to a chorus of urgent voices, all speaking at once in words I couldn't understand but whose meaning I somehow comprehended. "Don't. Stop. Release. Free. Hungry." My fingers closed around the cold metal. The voices reached a fever pitch, and the dirt floor began to sink beneath me, as if something was pulling it downward from below. With the last of my courage, I pried up the plate. Beneath it was not more dirt, but a small cavity containing what looked like a human heart, blackened and shriveled with age, but somehow not decayed. The journal had mentioned a binding ritual. This, then, was the anchor, the sacrifice that held whatever was in the walls in check. I understood in that moment that I needed to restore what I had disturbed. The bone box with the tooth lay where I dropped it in my panic the night before. I placed it back in the hole, next to the preserved heart, my hands shaking as the walls around me began to crack just as they had upstairs. "I'm closing the door," I said aloud, not knowing if the entity could understand me, but hoping it could sense my intent. "Stay inside the walls where you belong." I slid the metal plate back into place and dragged the table over it. The moment its legs touched the ground on all four corners, the cracking stopped. The whispering voices faded to a distant murmur, then to silence. I backed away, unwilling to turn my back on the table. When I reached the stairs, I fled upstairs and out the front door without looking back, not stopping until I reached Detective Wilson's car parked at the curb. "Did it work?" she asked, taking in my dirt-streaked face and trembling hands. "For now," I replied, watching the house. From the outside, it looked perfectly normal, just an old Victorian in need of some care. No one passing by would ever suspect what lived inside its walls, but I don't think it will hold forever. Nothing has so far. "So what now?" I took a deep breath. "Now I do what every other owner has done. I run, and then I make sure no one else moves in." 3 days later, I watched from a safe distance as flames consumed the house on Maple Street. The fire department arrived too late to save the structure, but they managed to prevent the blaze from spreading to neighboring homes. The official report would later rule it an electrical fire, typical in houses with outdated wiring. Only Detective Wilson and I knew the truth, that some doors are meant to stay closed, and some walls are built to keep things in rather than out. The entity that Dr. Carlton had trapped over a century ago was finally free, but it had been bound to the house for so long that when the structure collapsed, it had nowhere else to go. I still dream about the whispers sometimes, and in quiet moments I catch myself listening for scratching inside the walls of my new apartment in a city far away. I tell myself it's just my imagination, a lingering trauma from what I experienced. But sometimes, when I'm drifting off to sleep, I swear I can hear a voice, distant but growing clearer, whispering a simple message. "Found you again."